Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, for thousands of years, they lived across a land untouched by cities, kingdoms, or written history. They hunted giant Ice Age animals, crossed landscapes we can barely imagine, and left behind clues that still puzzle archaeologists today. But then, something changed. Ancient cultures disappeared. Entire ways of life were transformed. And even after more than 12,000 years, one question continues to divide experts. What really happened to America's first people? Was it a changing climate at the end of the Ice Age? The extinction of massive animals they depended on? New ways of migration? Or is the true story still buried beneath layers of forgotten history? Before starting the story, like and subscribe to my channel for more stories. Now, start the story. It says, tonight, we'll follow the evidence, from mysterious stone tools and ancient footprints to hidden campsites and remarkable discoveries that are rewriting what we thought we knew about the earliest people in the Americas. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and journey back to a world where every discovery raises another question, and where the greatest mystery may be how little we still know. Let us drift together now into a tale that stretches across the vast expanse of the Americas, a story so old and so deep that even after more than 2 centuries of digging, of studying bones and stones and genes, we still cannot agree on what truly happened here. This continent we call America holds a secret that is not hidden in dusty academic journals, but lies buried in the soil beneath your feet, written in ancient walls that seem to have no right to exist, encoded in our very blood in ways that point to unexpected origins, and softly spoken in the traditions of people whose ancestors witnessed extraordinary events across 12,000 years that textbooks have never fully explained. This is not a story about what we already know. It is a story about the great silence that surrounds what we do not know, and why that silence echoes louder than anything history has ever told us. If you're listening to drift into peaceful sleep, that is exactly why I create these gentle narratives. Perhaps you might subscribe and tell me where you are in this wide world and what time it is as we settle into this quiet journey together. Somewhere beneath the frozen plains of what we now call Siberia, a group of people once stood at the edge of a world that had no name. They did not know they were about to walk into history. They did not realize that the land bridge beneath their feet would one day vanish beneath the cold waters of the Bering Sea, sealing them off forever from everything they had ever known. They could not have imagined that their grandchildren's grandchildren would build cities deep in the jungles, raise towering walls of stone across desert plateaus, navigate the open ocean in canoes made from bark, and develop calendars more precise than anything Europe would produce for another 10,000 years. They simply walked forward, and in that simple act of walking, they changed everything. That is the familiar story, the Bering Land Bridge Theory, the idea that the first people crossed from Northeast Asia into Alaska during the last Great Ice Age, sometime between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago, when the sea levels were so low that a wide corridor of land connected the 2 continents. The theory is elegant, supported by genetics, by linguistics, by the distribution of certain tool technologies found on both sides of the Pacific. For decades, it was the unchallenged answer to one of archaeology's most fundamental questions. Where did the first Americans come from? But then the discoveries began to surface. Not just 1 or 2 anomalies that could be easily explained away, but dozens of them. Sites that pushed the dates further back than the theory could comfortably accommodate. Skulls that did not match the expected genetic profile. Artifacts that resembled technologies from places that should have had no connection to ancient America. Oral traditions that described events and migrations completely unlike what the textbooks proposed. And slowly, carefully, often reluctantly, a new picture began to take shape. A picture far more complicated, far more ancient, and far more mysterious than anyone had ever imagined. This is the story of what really happened to America's first people. Not just where they came from, but what they built, what they understood, what they survived, and what in some cases they became. It is a story that stretches across 12,000 years of documented prehistory, and perhaps much further back than that. It is a story filled with gaps and silences and things that do not quite fit. And those gaps are not accidents. They are clues waiting for us to pay attention. Let us begin at the beginning, or rather, let us begin at what we thought was the beginning and then slowly pull back the curtain. For most of the 20th century, the first Americans were believed to be the Clovis people, named after a site near Clovis, New Mexico, where distinctive fluted stone spear points were first identified in the 1930s. The Clovis culture was thought to represent the earliest human presence in the Americas, with dates placing them at roughly 13,000 years ago. The theory held that they crossed the Bering Land Bridge and then moved rapidly south through an ice-free corridor that opened between the retreating ice sheets as the last glacial period ended. Within a few thousand years, according to this model, their descendants had spread across both North and South America, populating an entire hemisphere from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. It was a clean, satisfying story. It explained the distribution of Clovis points across a wide swath of North America, explained the timing, and neatly accounted for the apparent absence of older human sites. The theory was so firmly established that for decades, any archaeologist who proposed an earlier date for American occupation risked professional ridicule. The phrase pre-Clovis was treated almost like a dirty word in certain academic circles. And then came Monte Verde, tucked into the forests of southern Chile, far south of where any early American should theoretically have been able to reach in a few thousand years. The site of Monte Verde preserved evidence of human occupation dating to at least 14,600 years ago. Some layers may go back as far as 33,000 years, though that deeper date remains controversial. But even the conservative estimate posed a serious problem for the Clovis first model. If people were living in southern Chile before the ice-free corridor was even open, they could not have arrived via the standard route. They had to have gotten there some other way. The archaeologist who excavated Monte Verde spent years defending his findings against a skeptical establishment. The evidence he presented was meticulous. Wooden structures preserved in waterlogged peat, hearths with plant remains, animal bones with cut marks, evidence of a diet that included seaweed, tubers, berries, and meat from mastodons. This was not a transient campsite. It was a settlement, a place where people had lived, worked, cooked, sheltered, and stayed long enough to leave complex traces in the sediment. The establishment eventually accepted Monte Verde, and in accepting it, they were forced to confront something deeply uncomfortable. The Clovis first theory was wrong, or at least incomplete. The first Americans had arrived earlier than anyone thought, and they had arrived by a different route. The leading alternative that emerged was the Kelp Highway Hypothesis. Instead of crossing through a central ice-free corridor, perhaps the first Americans had moved along the Pacific coastline, navigating by boat or on foot along the narrow ice-free zone at the edge of the sea, following the rich marine resources of the Pacific kelp forest ecosystem from Northeast Asia down through Alaska, along the coast of British Columbia, and into Central and South America. This route would have been opened earlier than the inland corridor, and it would explain how people reached the southern tip of South America so quickly. The Kelp Highway theory makes geographical sense. It fits the dates. It aligns with what we know about the maritime capabilities of Ice Age peoples in Northeast Asia, who were already accomplished seafarers. and it is supported by a growing body of coastal archaeological evidence, though much of that evidence now lies underwater, drowned by the rising sea levels that followed the end of the last ice age, making it almost impossible to recover. But the Kelp Highway alone does not explain everything, because as the sites kept accumulating, the picture kept getting stranger. At Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, carefully stratified layers of sediment contain artifacts and carbon-dated materials suggesting human presence as far back as 16,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier. The deepest layers have produced dates in a range of 19 to 20,000 years ago, which would place people in eastern North America right in the middle of the last glacial maximum, when ice covered much of the continent. Critics have questioned those dates, arguing for possible contamination, but the evidence has never been definitively discredited. At the Gault site in Texas, researchers found artifacts beneath a Clovis layer, artifacts made using a distinctive knapping technique unlike anything in the standard Clovis toolkit. The dates from those lower layers push back to 16,000 years or more, again disputed, again never fully dismissed. At Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, horse and mammoth bones bearing cut marks from stone tools have been dated to as far back as 24,000 years ago. If those cut marks were made by humans, and the morphology strongly suggests they were, then people were present in the Yukon during the height of the last ice age, long before any proposed migration routes were open. And then there is Chiquihuite Cave in Mexico, where a 2020 study published in the journal Nature reported stone tools from layers dated between 26,000 and 33,000 years ago. If confirmed, this would push the human presence in the Americas back to a time when two enormous ice sheets still covered most of North America, making any overland route from Asia essentially impossible. What does this mean? It means that either the dates are wrong, or the story is far older and far more complicated than we thought. And given how many independent sites now point toward pre-Clovis occupation, the idea that all of them are contaminated or misinterpreted is becoming harder and harder to sustain. Something was happening in the Americas long before the textbooks say it was. And the question of who those people were, where they came from, and what happened to them is one of the most fascinating and troubling puzzles in the entire history of human prehistory. Let's talk about genetics, because this is where things get truly strange. The standard genetic model of American origins holds that all Native American populations descend from a small founding group that crossed from Northeast Asia into the Americas sometime after the last glacial maximum. The genetic evidence for this is real. The vast majority of Native American people share a distinct suite of genetic markers that trace back to a single founding population with deep roots in East Asia and Siberia. This is not in dispute. What is in dispute is whether that founding population was the only wave and whether there were people in the Americas before them. In 2015, a study analyzed ancient DNA from across the Americas and found something extraordinary. Certain Amazonian populations, including the Surué, the Cariciana, and other groups from the Brazilian Amazon, showed a genetic signal that did not match their East Asian ancestry. Instead, it resembled the genetic profile of populations from Australia, Melanesia, and the Andaman Islands. The researchers called this ancestry Population Y, after the Tupi word for ancestor. This signal was not noise. It was real, statistically significant, and deeply puzzling. It suggested that at some point in the deep past, people with ancestry more closely related to Australasians than to East Asians had made their way into the Americas and contributed to the ancestry of certain Amazonian groups. How they got there, when they arrived, and what relationship they had to the founding Clovis-related populations is not known. One hypothesis is that they arrived very early, before the main migration wave from Northeast Asia, and that they were gradually absorbed by later arrivals. Another is that they took a different route entirely, perhaps crossing the Pacific by boat in a period of navigation we have no record of. A third possibility is that the signal reflects some deep ancestral connection from a population in Asia that has since disappeared, a ghost population that no longer exists and left its genetic trace only in the Americas and in the islands of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. None of these explanations is satisfying. None of them is complete. But the genetic signal is there, and it does not go away no matter how many ways you look at the data. And there is more. Studies of the Chiquihuite Man, a 9,000-year-old skeleton found in Washington state in 1996, showed a genetic profile that did not match modern Native American populations as closely as expected. More recent ancient DNA work has clarified some of this, suggesting that Chiquihuite Man does have deep ancestry in common with modern Native Americans. But the early morphological analyses that suggested his skull was more similar to Polynesians or the Ainu of Japan than to modern Native Americans fueled decades of controversy and opened a door that has never been completely closed. The Ainu connection is particularly interesting. The Ainu are the indigenous people of Japan's northernmost island of Hokkaido and the Kuril Islands, and they represent a genetic and cultural lineage with very deep roots in the North Pacific region. Some early researchers noticed morphological similarities between certain ancient American skulls and the Ainu, and a small number of genetic studies have suggested a more substantial Ainu-related signal in some Native American populations than can be easily explained by the standard migration model. The implications of this are still being worked out. What all of this genetic complexity suggests is that the peopling of the Americas was not a single event. It was a series of events involving multiple populations, multiple routes, and multiple time periods. The standard single-wave Bering Land Bridge model captures part of the truth, but not all of it. And the parts it misses are the parts that contain some of the most extraordinary and unexplained episodes in human prehistory. Now, let us turn to the stones, because if the genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that the Americas were settled earlier and by more diverse peoples than the textbooks acknowledge, the physical remains they left behind tell an even more bewildering story. In the hills of New Hampshire, Vermont, and across New England, there are structures that have puzzled researchers for generations. Stone chambers, standing stones, stone circles, underground chambers with cobbled roofs, and carefully aligned entranceways that frame the sunrise or sunset on the solstices or equinoxes. They look like nothing in the Native American architectural tradition of the Northeast. They look to some eyes disturbingly like structures found in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany. Megalithic structures, Neolithic structures. The mainstream explanation for these New England stone chambers is that they were built by early colonial-era farmers as root cellars and livestock shelters. And certainly some of them were. Colonial Americans did build stone structures. And some of the chambers in New England are unquestionably colonial in origin. But others have been excavated and dated, and the results have been unsettling. Some chambers have produced carbon dates, suggesting construction or use thousands of years before European contact. At Mystery Hill in New Hampshire, now known as America's Stonehenge, multiple radiocarbon dates from charcoal found within and around the stone structures cluster around 4,000 years ago, with some dates extending to 8,000 years before present. Who built these structures? The accepted answer is still disputed. No one has definitively identified the builders. No tool assemblage clearly associated with them. No burial sites directly connected. They sit in the landscape like questions without answers. And the academic community has largely chosen to ignore them rather than investigate them with the rigor they deserve. The same pattern of avoidance marks the treatment of certain rock art sites, earthworks, and constructed features across the continent. In the Ohio River Valley, the Hopewell culture built an elaborate network of geometric earthworks covering hundreds of square miles. Earthworks so precisely laid out that the alignments to celestial events and the proportional relationships between different enclosures suggest a sophisticated understanding of geometry, astronomy, and landscape architecture. These people were not living in simple villages. They were part of a complex continent-spanning network of exchange and ceremony that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. The Newark earthworks in Ohio are perhaps the most astonishing expression of this tradition. Covering more than 4 square miles, this complex of circles, octagons, and connecting walls is the largest earthen enclosure ever built by any culture anywhere in the world. The octagon earthwork at Newark is aligned to the 18.6-year lunar cycle, the maximum northerly rising of the moon, with such precision that it can only have been achieved through generations of careful astronomical observation. The people who built this were not just mound builders. They were astronomers, mathematicians, and engineers of the first order. And yet, the Newark earthworks are now largely covered by a golf course. A golf course, one of the most extraordinary archaeological monuments in human history, sits beneath a private golf club in central Ohio, and the efforts of archaeologists and indigenous communities to preserve and study it have been met with decades of resistance from the club's membership. Let that image sit with you for a moment. The greatest earthwork ever constructed by human hands, a monument to the astronomical genius of civilization we barely understand, used as a fairway. There is something deeply revealing about that, about what we choose to protect and what we choose to pave over, about who gets to tell the story of the past and whose past gets told. Moving west, the mystery deepens and takes on different shapes. In the deserts of the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans, formerly called the Anasazi, left behind a legacy that continues to confound archaeologists. The massive stone structures at Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, built between 850 and 1150 CE, represent an architectural and social achievement that remains poorly understood. The great houses at Chaco, some of them standing 4 or 5 stories tall and containing hundreds of rooms, were connected to an elaborate network of roads that stretched for hundreds of miles across the desert in perfectly straight lines. Those roads are worth pausing on. The Chacoans built roads that were 30 feet wide, perfectly straight, and engineered to maintain their bearing regardless of terrain, cutting through hills or climbing directly up cliff faces via broad staircases rather than detouring around obstacles. The roads connect Chaco to dozens of outlier communities across the San Juan Basin. They are not trade routes in the conventional sense because they are too straight for practical travel. They appear to have been ceremonial or symbolic in nature, encoding the spatial philosophy of a culture that understood itself as the center of a cosmological network. And then Chaco was abandoned. Around 1150 CE, the great houses went silent. The roads emptied. The elaborate ceremony that had drawn people from across the region ceased. The reasons are still argued over. Drought is often cited, and there was indeed a prolonged dry period in the mid-12th century. But drought alone does not explain why such a complex and sophisticated society would simply dissolve, why the population dispersed, why no other group moved in to occupy those massive stone structures. Some researchers have pointed to evidence of violence and social breakdown in the final decades of Chaco's occupation. There are burned rooms. There are burials that suggest sacrifice or execution. There is evidence of extreme social stratification in the final period, with a small elite consuming enormous quantities of food and ritual goods, while the broader population may have been struggling. Was Chaco destroyed from within? Did its own hierarchies become so oppressive that the people ultimately walked away? Or was something else happening? Something we do not yet have the tools to understand? The descendants of the Chiquihuans are the modern Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, and their oral traditions speak of the abandonment in terms that blend the historical and the cosmological. The people left, they say, because the world became out of balance, because the spiritual reciprocity that bound the community together was broken, because the leaders forgot their obligations to the people and to the land. These are not explanations that fit neatly into the categories of academic archaeology, but they carry a kind of truth that the drought hypothesis alone does not capture. Let us go further north and further back. In the western Great Lakes region, there's a submerged landscape that most Americans have never heard of. Beneath the cold waters of Lake Huron, at a depth of about 100 feet, there is a ridge called the Alpine Amberley Ridge, a long, narrow shelf of land that would have been exposed above water during the low lake levels of the early post-glacial period, roughly 10,000 years ago. And on that ridge, divers have discovered something remarkable. Lines of stones arranged in chevron patterns, apparently designed to funnel caribou toward waiting hunters. Drive lanes, ancient caribou hunting structures preserved beneath the lake. The Alpine Amberley Ridge site suggests that people were living and hunting on land that is now underwater. That entire chapters of early American prehistory are literally submerged, invisible to the standard archaeological methods that focus on dry land. How many other sites lie beneath the Great Lakes, beneath the continental shelf, beneath the shallow coastal waters that were dry land during the last ice age? Nobody knows, but the potential scale of what we are missing is staggering. The same problem affects our understanding of the Pacific Northwest coast and the Gulf of Mexico coast. During the last glacial maximum, sea levels were roughly 400 feet lower than they are today. Vast areas of what is now the continental shelf were exposed as dry land. And those areas would have been some of the most productive environments on the continent, with rich coastal resources, sheltered valleys, and freshwater rivers. If people arrived by the Kelp Highway, they would have passed through these landscapes. They would have camped on these shores, built their fires, left their tools, buried their dead. All of that is now underwater. We're trying to reconstruct the story of the first Americans using only the chapters that happen to have survived above sea level. It is like trying to read a novel when half the pages have been torn out and thrown into the ocean. And yet, even with those missing chapters, the story that remains is astonishing enough. Let's talk about the cultures that emerged across North America in the millennia before European contact. Because the word primitive, which was so casually applied to pre-Columbian peoples by the first European observers and by generations of historians after them, is not just wrong. It is almost comically inadequate. Along the Gulf Coast and the lower Mississippi Valley, between roughly 5,000 and 1,000 years ago, a series of complex societies built some of the most ambitious earth monuments in the world. The earliest and in some ways most mysterious of these was the culture centered at Poverty Point in what is now northeastern Louisiana. Dated to roughly 3,400 years ago, Poverty Point consisted of a series of enormous concentric earthen ridges arranged in a semicircle, with massive mounds placed at specific points around the complex. The largest mound, known as Mound A, is 72 feet tall and contains an estimated 258,000 cubic yards of soil, all of it moved by hand. What makes Poverty Point so extraordinary is not just its size. It is what the site tells us about the social organization required to build it. The people who built Poverty Point were hunter-gatherers. They were not farmers. They did not have draft animals. They had no metal tools. And yet, they mobilized the labor and coordination necessary to construct one of the largest pre-Columbian monuments north of Mexico. Apparently without the coercive hierarchy that most archaeologists assume is necessary for such projects. The artifacts found at Poverty Point include materials from across an enormous trade network. Copper from the Great Lakes, galena from the Midwest, red jasper from the Ozarks, soapstone from the Appalachians, chert from Tennessee and Indiana. The people of Poverty Point were embedded in a continental exchange network of remarkable scope, moving goods over hundreds and thousands of miles through mechanisms we do not fully understand. And then Poverty Point declined and was eventually abandoned. The reasons are unknown. The culture it represented left no clear descendants. No successor society that maintained its traditions in recognizable form. It is one of the many chapters of North American prehistory that ends in a silence we cannot explain. Further north and further east, another mysterious fluorescence was taking shape in the Ohio River Valley. The Adena culture, dating from roughly 1000 BCE to 200 CE, built burial mounds across a wide area of present-day Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. They are named after a large mound on an estate called Adena near Chillicothe, Ohio. Their mounds often contained elaborate burials with rich grave goods, including copper ornaments, shell beads, stone tablets carved with geometric designs, and occasionally human remains showing signs of cranial modification, a practice in which the skulls of infants were deliberately shaped by binding. The Adena gave way to, or were absorbed by, the Hopewell tradition, which reached its fluorescence between about 100 BCE and 500 CE, and represented perhaps the most geographically extensive cultural network in North American prehistory before the Mississippian period. Hopewell is not a single culture or a single polity. It is an interaction sphere, a network of exchange and shared ceremonial practice that linked communities from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes and from the Great Plains to the Atlantic coast. At the heart of this network were elaborate mortuary rituals, burial mounds, and geometric earthworks that served as ceremonial centers. The materials moving through the Hopewell Exchange Network are breathtaking in their geographic scope. Grizzly bear teeth and obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from Lake Superior, mica from the southern Appalachians, shark teeth and marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, alligator teeth from Florida, silver from Ontario, meteoric iron from scattered impact sites across the continent. These are not just trade goods. They were sacred materials charged with cosmological meaning, transformed by skilled artisans into objects of extraordinary beauty and power. Hopewell artisans worked copper with a sophistication that astonishes modern metal workers. They produced effigy pipes with portrait-quality human faces, animal sculptures with anatomically precise detail, and ceremonial objects of such delicacy that they could only have been made by specialists who devoted their entire working lives to the craft. The famous Hopewell mica cutouts, thin silhouettes of human hands, bears, serpents, and other forms cut from sheets of mica with extraordinary precision, are among the finest examples of pre-Columbian art anywhere in North America. And then around 500 CE, the Hopewell tradition declined. The great geometric earthworks stopped being built. The exotic materials stopped flowing through the exchange network. The elaborate mortuary ceremonies wound down. The reasons are debated. Climate change, the introduction of bow and arrow technology, political fragmentation, the disruption of trade routes, all have been proposed. None has been definitively established. What followed the Hopewell decline was a period sometimes called the Dark Ages of North American prehistory, a few centuries during which the archaeological record becomes simpler, less elaborate, less geographically interconnected. And then around 700 to 800 CE, something remarkable happened. a new tradition emerged in the central Mississippi Valley that would eventually produce the most complex and most mysterious pre-Columbian civilization north of Mexico. This was the Mississippian culture, and its greatest expression was the city we now call Cahokia. Cahokia sits on the American bottom, a wide, fertile floodplain on the eastern side of the Mississippi River, just across from what is now St. Louis, Missouri. At its peak, roughly between 900 and 1100 CE, Cahokia was the largest city in pre-Columbian North America north of Mexico, home to an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 people, with perhaps another 50 to 100,000 living in the surrounding region. It was by any measure a city, a planned urban center with a distinct downtown, satellite communities, a complex social hierarchy, specialized craft production, long-distance trade, and a political organization capable of mobilizing enormous amounts of labor for monumental construction. The most obvious expression of that monumental ambition is Monk's Mound, the largest pre-Columbian structure north of Mexico. Monk's Mound rises in 4 terraces to a height of 100 feet, covers 14 acres at its base, and contains an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth. All of it moved by hand, basket by basket, over multiple generations of construction. The summit of Monk's Mound supported a large wooden building, probably a temple or the residence of Cahokia's paramount leader, which has been estimated at 100 feet long and 50 feet wide. The scale of Monk's Mound is easier to appreciate if you compare it to something familiar. Its base footprint is larger than that of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Let that sink in. A structure built by people in what is now Illinois, using no metal tools, no draft animals, no wheeled vehicles, has a larger footprint than the Great Pyramid. And unlike the Great Pyramid, which sits in a desert and has been studied and celebrated for millennia, Monk's Mound sits next to a highway interchange in the St. Louis metropolitan area, partially obscured by trees, visited by a fraction of the tourists who pass within a few miles of it every year. Cahokia was surrounded by a stockade, a wooden palisade that enclosed the central precinct of the city and would have required the cutting of thousands of large trees. Inside the palisade, there were plazas, smaller mounds, charnel houses for the processing of the dead, and the workshops of specialized craftspeople. Outside it, residential areas spread for miles, organized into neighborhoods that have been mapped by archaeologists through decades of survey and excavation. One of the most haunting discoveries at Cahokia is a series of mass burials at a mound designated Mound 72. In this mound, excavators found a burial of extraordinary elaboration. A prominent individual, apparently a leader or a figure of great ceremonial importance, had been laid on a bed of 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon. Nearby, 4 young men had been buried without heads or hands, apparently sacrificed at the time of the main burial. And in a series of pits nearby, the remains of more than 270 individuals were found, most of them young women, most of them strangled or beheaded, apparently offered as mass human sacrifices over a period of years. This discovery changed the way archaeologists thought about Cahokia. It suggested that the city's elaboration and power rested on a foundation of violence, coercion, and ideological control that was darker and more complex than the benign mound builder image that had previously dominated the popular imagination. Cahokia was not just an impressive city. It was a place where some people held enormous power over others, and where that power was expressed in the most extreme possible terms. And then Cahokia declined. Between about 1100 and 1400 CE, the population decreased, the monumental construction ceased, and eventually the city was abandoned. By the time European explorers reached the region in the 17th century, Cahokia was a ghost, its great mounds overgrown, its plazas empty, its memory surviving only in the faint traces preserved by neighboring peoples who kept their distance from the ruins. Why did Cahokia fall? The standard explanations involve environmental degradation, deforestation around the city that led to erosion and flooding, climate shifts associated with the medieval warm period and its subsequent cooling, political instability, and the possible breakdown of the ideological system that had held the city together. All of these factors may have played a role. But Cahokia's decline is also tangled up in a larger pattern of collapse and transformation that swept across much of North America in the centuries before European contact. A pattern that suggests something more systematic was happening, something that affected multiple cultures across a wide geographic area. Let us step back and look at that larger pattern. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloan culture was consolidating into the great cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde and Canyon de Chelly and the great houses of Chaco Canyon between about 900 and 1100 CE, then dramatically reorganizing and in many cases abandoning these sites between about 1200 and 1400 CE. The cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, which represents some of the most ambitious residential architecture ever produced in pre-Columbian North America, were occupied for only a few generations before being permanently abandoned around 1280 CE. In the southeast, the Mississippian culture was spreading across the central and eastern part of the continent, building mound centers and organizing regional polities, but showing signs of increasing violence, competition, and instability from around 1200 CE onward. Fortifications became more common at Mississippian sites in this period. Evidence of massacre and mass burial multiplies. The pattern suggests that the centuries before European contact were not a period of stable equilibrium, but of significant turbulence and transformation. On the Great Plains, the climate was shifting. A prolonged drought that affected much of the central and western parts of the continent between roughly 900 and 1300 CE, known to climatologists as the medieval drought, put enormous pressure on the peoples of the plains and the southwest. Communities that had been farming the semi-arid margins of the plains retreated to more reliable water sources. Populations that had been relatively stable began moving, colliding, competing. In the Pacific Northwest, the rich marine and forest resources of the coast supported some of the most complex hunter-gatherer societies in the world. The peoples of this region built large cedar plank houses, constructed ocean-going canoes capable of hunting whales offshore, developed elaborate ceremonial systems, including the potlatch, and produced some of the most sophisticated wood-carving traditions anywhere in the pre-Columbian world. Their social organization included hereditary nobility, slavery, and complex systems of rank and prestige. They were not in any meaningful sense simple or primitive. And on the Great Plains themselves, the image of the mounted nomadic buffalo hunter that dominates the popular imagination of Native American life is almost entirely a post-contact phenomenon. Before the reintroduction of horses by the Spanish in the 16th and 17th centuries, Plains peoples were primarily pedestrian. They hunted bison on foot using cooperative driving techniques to stampede herds over cliffs or into corrals. They also farmed, fished, and gathered along the river valleys that cut through the grasslands. The image of the mounted warrior on the open plains is less than 500 years old, a transformation so rapid and so total that it obscures the much longer and more complex history of Plains peoples. All of this is to say that the pre-Columbian Americas were not static. They were not a timeless, unchanging wilderness populated by simple peoples living in perfect balance with nature. They were dynamic, complex, innovative, and turbulent. They were places where civilizations rose and fell, where populations moved and mixed and competed, where technologies were invented and diffused and lost, where ideas spread across thousands of miles through networks of exchange and ceremony. They were, in other words, human. But there is one aspect of this history that remains more mysterious than any other, and that is the question of contact. For most of the 20th century, the dominant paradigm in archaeology held that the Americas before Columbus were completely isolated from the rest of the world. The Bering Land Bridge had been submerged for thousands of years. The Pacific and Atlantic Oceans were impassable barriers. No contact had occurred. The Americas developed in splendid isolation, and whatever similarities existed between Old World and New World cultures were the product of independent invention, of human minds solving similar problems in similar ways. If Polynesians reached South America, who else might have? The Pacific is vast, but it was not impossible to skilled navigators. Jaman pottery from Japan, some of the oldest pottery in the world, bears intriguing resemblances to certain Valdivia pottery from Ecuador, dated to around 3,500 BCE. The resemblance is controversial, and the hypothesis that fishermen accidentally or deliberately made it to Ecuador has never been proven, but it has also never been definitively disproven. And the genetic and cultural complexity of South American populations leaves room for contact scenarios that have not yet been fully explored. On the Atlantic side, the question of African contact has long been controversial. The gigantic stone heads carved by the Olmec civilization of Mexico's Gulf Coast, the earliest and in many ways the most mysterious of the great Mesoamerican civilizations, have faces that some researchers describe as distinctly African in their features, with broad noses, full lips, and physical proportions unlike those typical of Mesoamerican populations. This observation has inspired a persistent hypothesis that Olmec civilization was founded or influenced by African seafarers who crossed the Atlantic. The mainstream archaeological position is that this hypothesis is not supported by solid evidence. No African artifacts have been found at Olmec sites. No African genetic signals have been identified in ancient Olmec populations. The physical features of the Olmec heads, to the extent that they can be meaningfully compared to modern populations, given that they are artistic representations rather than skeletal remains, could equally be interpreted as representing a robust physical type found among certain indigenous American populations. But the Olmec remain mysterious for other reasons entirely. They appear in the archaeological record fully formed, with no clear developmental period visible in the southern Gulf Coast lowlands where they flourished. Their writing, or rather the proto-writing that appears on Olmec monuments and portable objects, has never been convincingly deciphered. Their monumental sculpture, including those famous colossal heads, required the transport of basalt boulders weighing up to 40 tons from quarries in the Tuxtla Mountains more than 60 miles away. A logistical achievement that implies a level of social organization and technical sophistication that we do not fully understand for the period in question. The Olmec were the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the civilization from which the later traditions of the Maya, the Zapotec, the Teotihuacanos, and ultimately the Aztec all drew in various ways. Their influence radiated across a wide area of southern Mexico and Central America through mechanisms that remain imperfectly understood. And then around 400 BCE, the main centers were abandoned or destroyed. The great basalt heads were deliberately buried or defaced, and the tradition that had animated one of the most creative civilizations in the pre-Columbian world came to an end. Why? We do not know. And the silence around that question is one of the most uncomfortable silences in the entire field of pre-Columbian studies. Let us come back to North America and to some of its most specific and most perplexing mysteries. In the 1830s, a young lawyer from New York named Joseph Smith published a book that he claimed was a translation of gold plates written in an ancient language he called Reformed Egyptian. The book, which became the founding scripture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, described ancient migrations of peoples from the Middle East to the Americas, civilizations, wars, prophets, and the divine history of the Western Hemisphere. From the perspective of academic archaeology, the Book of Mormon describes events and peoples for which there is no archaeological evidence. But the cultural and political influence of the Latter-day Saint tradition on American attitudes toward pre-Columbian history has been significant. And the history of how that tradition has been received and rejected by mainstream archaeology is itself a story about power, evidence, and the politics of knowledge. I mention this not to endorse the Book of Mormon as history, but to note that the desire for a grand narrative of the pre-Columbian Americas, a narrative that connects the New World to the Old in deep and meaningful ways, is not a fringe impulse. It reflects a genuine human need to understand origins, to locate ourselves in a story that makes the world comprehensible. That need is felt by the scholars who write academic papers as well as by the religious believers who read scripture, and it sometimes distorts both. The history of serious scholarship on pre-Columbian America is littered with grand theories that turn out to be wrong, or at least not as right as their proponents believed. Diffusionism, the idea that most of the world's great civilizations derive from a single source, and that similarities between distant cultures prove direct contact, was the dominant paradigm in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It generated theories about lost continents, about Phoenician sailors in the Americas, about Egyptian colonization of Mexico, about Hindu influence on Mayan cosmology. Most of these theories were not the product of careful evidence, but of the same colonial framework that assumed non-European peoples could not have independently developed complex civilizations. The reaction against diffusionism, which became dominant in American archaeology from the mid-20th century onward, was in many ways salutary. It forced scholars to take seriously the independent creativity and ingenuity of pre-Columbian peoples, to recognize that the Americas had their own developmental trajectories that did not need to be explained by reference to the Old World. But the reaction also overshot. In the determination to avoid the excesses of diffusionism, mainstream archaeology became almost allergic to any evidence of pre-Columbian contact, dismissing findings that might deserve more careful consideration, and enforcing an orthodoxy of isolation that has its own ideological freight. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in the middle. The Americas were largely isolated from the rest of the world for most of their human history, and the civilizations that developed there were genuinely independent achievements. But they were not completely isolated. There were contacts, encounters, exchanges. The extent and nature of those contacts is still being worked out, and working it out requires the willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads in uncomfortable directions. Now, let's talk about something that is even more contested, and in some ways even more important than the question of contact. Let us talk about what happened to the people who were already here when the Europeans arrived. The standard narrative taught in American schools goes something like this. Columbus sailed in 1492. Europeans arrived in the Americas. They brought diseases to which the native populations had no immunity. Millions died. The surviving indigenous peoples were gradually displaced, conquered, or assimilated. By the 19th century, their populations had been reduced to a fraction of their pre-contact numbers, confined to reservations, and largely stripped of their land, language, and culture. This tragedy is acknowledged, even lamented, but it is often presented as something that happened in the past, a historical injustice that has been at least partially addressed by modern recognition and policy. What this narrative leaves out is the scale of the catastrophe. And the scale is so enormous that when you actually look at the numbers, what happened in the Americas after European contact becomes the largest demographic disaster in human history. Before Columbus, the population of the Americas is estimated by modern scholars to have been somewhere between 50 million and 112 million people. That is a wide range, reflecting genuine uncertainty about pre-contact population levels. But even the low end of that range represents an enormous number of people living sophisticated, complex lives across two continents. The highest estimates associated with the work of demographers like Henry Dobbins in the 1960s suggest that the Americas may have held as many as 112 million people, which would have made the Western Hemisphere more densely populated than Europe at the time of contact. Within roughly a century and a half of European arrival, the indigenous population of the Americas had been reduced by an estimated 90%. In some regions, the reduction was closer to 95 or 99%. The diseases that led to this collapse, primarily smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and a host of other Old World pathogens to which American populations had no prior exposure, swept ahead of European settlement in waves, reaching and devastating populations that had never seen a European face. In many parts of North America, European explorers moving through the interior in the 17th and 18th centuries encountered a landscape that appeared to them as primeval wilderness, unsettled and untouched, when in fact they were moving through the aftermath of an almost unimaginably large catastrophe, through landscapes that had been densely populated and extensively managed just a few generations earlier. This has led some historians to argue that what Europeans interpreted as the American wilderness was not a natural state at all, but a post-collapse landscape, a land emptied by disease, where the forests had grown back over former fields, the deer had multiplied in the absence of human hunters, and the rivers ran clear through valleys that had recently supported large agricultural communities. The evidence for this interpretation is substantial. Archaeological surveys consistently find pre-contact population densities higher than the 19th century figures that were once used to estimate pre-contact numbers. Soil analyses show that vast areas of Amazonia contain dark, rich earth known as terra preta that can only have been created by long-term human occupation and management. Terra preta soils that now support some of the most biologically productive forests in the Amazon. Tree-ring data from the Andes shows that the Little Ice Age, which began around 1500 CE, was preceded by a significant cooling event that some climatologists have linked to the reforestation of previously cleared land in the Americas following the population collapse. In other words, the death of 50 to 100 million people may have been large enough to cool the planet. The scale of what happened is not just a historical tragedy. It is one of the most consequential events in human history, one that reshaped the ecology of two continents, altered the global climate, and set in motion the processes that produced the modern world. And yet, it is barely taught in schools, barely acknowledged in public discourse, and frequently denied or minimized by those who find it inconvenient. But the story does not end with collapse. The story of America's first people is also a story of survival, adaptation, resistance, and renaissance. And that part of the story is equally extraordinary. Let us go back to the period just before European contact and look at what was actually happening across North America in the century or two leading up to 1492. The southeastern United States in the late pre-contact period was dominated by the Mississippian culture and its regional variants. Large chiefdoms controlled river valleys across the interior southeast, building platform mounds at their political centers, organizing tributary systems, conducting elaborate ceremonies, and engaging in frequent warfare. The De Soto expedition of 1539 to 1543, the first major European penetration of the interior southeast, encountered a landscape teeming with large and powerful polities, densely populated towns, sophisticated agricultural systems, and chiefs who commanded thousands of warriors. Within a century of De Soto's passage, those polities had collapsed. Their towns were empty, their chiefs were gone, and the landscape De Soto had moved through was unrecognizable to later European explorers. The Natchez people of the lower Mississippi Valley preserved the Mississippian tradition into the historical period, maintaining a hereditary monarch they called the Great Sun, a system of social classes organized on cosmic principles, and elaborate ceremonial practices, including human sacrifice at the death of the Great Sun. They were destroyed in a series of wars with the French in the 1720s and 1730s. Their survivors scattered and were absorbed into other peoples. The Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, the League of Five, and later Six Nations, was one of the most sophisticated political systems in pre-Columbian North America. A confederacy of 5 originally independent nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, united by a constitution of remarkable complexity that governed their collective decision-making, resolved disputes between member nations, and provided mechanisms for incorporating new peoples and addressing grievances. The founding of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is traditionally dated by the Haudenosaunee themselves to a solar eclipse, which some researchers have used to argue for a founding date in the 12th or 15th century CE. The political philosophy of the Haudenosaunee, their emphasis on consensus, on the representation of different interests, on the peaceful resolution of conflict, and on the participation of women in political decision-making through the clan mothers, who held significant authority in selecting and removing chiefs, influenced European political thinkers who encountered it in the colonial period. The extent to which the Haudenosaunee Confederacy influenced the framers of the United States Constitution is a matter of ongoing historical debate, but that there was contact and mutual influence between Haudenosaunee political culture and colonial American political thinking is well established. In the Pacific Northwest, the peoples of the coast were navigating complex social hierarchies, building some of the largest wooden structures in the pre-contact world, and creating artistic traditions of extraordinary sophistication. The carved cedar totem poles, house posts, and ceremonial objects of the Northwest Coast peoples represent one of the most distinctive and accomplished artistic traditions in human history. A tradition that was very nearly destroyed by the policies of the Canadian and American governments in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which banned the potlatch ceremony that animated this artistic production and forcibly removed thousands of children from their communities to residential and boarding schools where their language and culture were systematically suppressed. On the Great Plains, the period just before European contact was marked by the spread of agricultural communities into the valleys of the major rivers, the development of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Iroquois Earth Lodge villages along the Missouri, and the continued importance of bison hunting for both agricultural and nomadic peoples. The introduction of the horse into the plains in the late 17th century transformed all of this almost overnight, creating the mounted nomadic cultures that dominated the plains in the 18th and 19th centuries and that still shape the popular image of the American Indian. In the Arctic and subarctic, the Thule culture had spread across the Arctic coast from Alaska to Greenland, becoming the ancestors of modern Inuit peoples. The Thule were extraordinary maritime hunters, pursuing bowhead whales and skin boats, and developing a material culture perfectly adapted to the harshest environments on Earth. Their expansion across the Arctic between about 900 to 1200 CE was rapid, and it was associated with the warm period of the medieval warm period, which opened the Arctic seas to navigation and pushed the ranges of marine mammals and sea ice in ways that may have facilitated the Thule expansion. In the southwest, the reorganization following the collapse of Chaco Canyon had produced new social and political configurations. The large Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley, the Hopi Mesas in Arizona, and the Zuni communities in New Mexico maintained their agricultural traditions, their ceremonial life, and their connections to the deep past of ancestral Puebloan civilization, even as they adapted to new political circumstances and demographic realities. When the Spanish arrived in the Southwest in the 16th century, they encountered thriving, populous communities with sophisticated agricultural systems, elaborate ceremonial traditions, and a determination to preserve their way of life that would eventually lead to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the most successful indigenous uprising against European colonialism in North American history. The Pueblo Revolt, led by a man named Pope from Oke-Owenja, united the previously independent Pueblo communities in a coordinated uprising that drove the Spanish entirely out of New Mexico for 12 years, killing several hundred colonists and missionaries and forcing the remainder to retreat to El Paso. When the Spanish returned in 1692, they were compelled to govern on terms far more favorable to the Pueblo peoples than before, preserving a degree of cultural autonomy that allowed Pueblo communities to maintain their ceremonial traditions, their languages, and their identity in ways that communities in less fortunate circumstances could not. The story of the Pueblo Revolt is often told as a footnote to colonial history. It deserves a much larger place in the American historical consciousness. It was an act of collective resistance that succeeded, that preserved the cultural and physical existence of a people, and that demonstrated the possibility of indigenous peoples not merely surviving, but actively shaping the terms of their own survival. Let's talk about language, because the linguistic diversity of pre-Columbian North America is one of the most astonishing and least appreciated facts about the continent's human history. Before European contact, North America north of Mexico was home to somewhere between 300 and 400 distinct languages, organized into roughly 50 or 60 distinct language families with no demonstrable relationship to each other or to any language family in the Old World. This level of linguistic diversity is staggering. To put it in perspective, all of Europe from Portugal to Russia is home to essentially three major language families: Indo-European, Uralic, and the Basque Isolate. North America had 50 to 60. Each of those language families represents thousands of years of separate development. Divergence from some common ancestral language, so ancient that modern linguists can reconstruct no features of it. This linguistic diversity implies something profound about the depth and complexity of human occupation of North America. Languages diverge slowly. The kind of diversity found in North America requires tens of thousands of years of separation and independent development. It implies that the Americas were settled not once, not twice, but many times in many ways over a very long period. It implies populations living in relative isolation from each other for millennia, developing not just different languages, but different ways of thinking about the world encoded in those languages. Some of those language families are so isolated that they have no known relatives anywhere. Zuni, the language of the Zuni people of New Mexico, is a language isolate with no established relationship to any other language family. Kootenai, spoken along the upper Columbia River, is another language isolate. Haida, spoken on Haida Gwaii off the coast of British Columbia, has no established relatives. These isolated languages are like individual stars without galaxies. Entire linguistic traditions that developed in isolation from everything around them, representing lineages of human speech going back into deep prehistory. The diversity of sign languages is equally remarkable. On the Great Plains, A shared system of sign language developed that allowed people who spoke mutually incomprehensible spoken languages to communicate across the entire Plains area. Plains Indian Sign Language was a full linguistic system capable of expressing complex ideas and narratives, and it was used as a lingua franca by peoples from dozens of different language groups. It is one of many innovations in communication and knowledge sharing that the pre-Columbian peoples of North America developed in the absence of shared written tradition. Writing, or proto-writing, did exist in North America before European contact. The Mi'kmaq people of eastern Canada used a system of hieroglyphic script to record prayers, songs, and spiritual texts. The Cherokee syllabary, invented in the early 19th century by Sequoyah and adopted with remarkable speed by the Cherokee Nation, was preceded by earlier pictographic traditions. The Anishinaabe used a system of pictographic symbols on birch bark scrolls to record the sacred traditions of the Midwu Wind Medicine Society. These are not writing systems in the narrow sense of representing spoken language phonetically, but they are systems of encoding meaning in visual form, and they represent a tradition of graphic communication that goes back much further than the historical period. The Mixtec and Aztec peoples of Mexico developed more elaborate pictographic systems that could record historical events, tribute lists, calendrical information, and cosmological narratives. The Maya developed the only fully phonetic writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas, a complex script capable of representing all the nuances of spoken Maya language. And they used it to record history, mythology, astronomy, mathematics, and ritual. The decipherment of Maya writing, largely accomplished in the second half of the 20th century, has transformed our understanding of Maya civilization, revealing a history of named kings, dynastic warfare, elaborate court intrigue, and sophisticated intellectual achievement that the earlier image of the Maya as peaceful astronomers living in empty, ceremonial cities completely obscured. The Maya were not just watching the stars. They were calculating the movements of Venus with an accuracy that rivals modern astronomical observation. They were developing a mathematical system that included the concept of zero, one of the most profound intellectual innovations in the history of human thought, independently of, and in some cases earlier than its development in India and the Arab world. They were engineering massive hydraulic systems to manage water in a seasonally dry environment. And they were doing all of this while their kings fought constant wars, conducted ritual bloodletting on their own bodies as offerings to the gods, and occasionally sacrificed captives in elaborate public ceremonies. The Maya are not a lost civilization. Their descendants, millions of them, live today in Mexico and Central America, speaking dozens of related Maya languages, maintaining traditions that connect them to the ancient past, and actively participating in the archaeological and anthropological study of their own history. The narrative of the lost Maya, popularized by 19th century explorers like John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood, who wrote of finding Maya cities in the jungle as though they had been discovered by Europeans rather than simply visited for the first time by them, has been thoroughly revised by modern scholarship and by the Maya people themselves. But the story of what happened to the people who built those cities, of the collapse of classic Maya civilization between about 800–900 CE, remains one of the most compelling mysteries in the pre-Columbian world. During what archaeologists call the Terminal Classic period, the great lowland cities of the Petén and the Yucatan were one by one abandoned. The last dated monument at most major sites records a date in the early 9th century CE. The building program ceased. The ruling dynasties vanished from the record. The populations dispersed. The explanations proposed for the classic Maya collapse include drought, which the geological record confirms was severe in the 9th century, warfare, which the archaeological and epigraphic record shows was intensifying in the late classic period, political fragmentation, the breakdown of the tributary systems that supported the great royal courts, and ecological degradation, the depletion of soils and forests that supported the dense agricultural populations of the lowlands. It almost certainly includes some combination of all of these factors, interacting in ways that produced a cascade of failures too rapid and too total for any social system to absorb. But here's what is missing from most accounts of the Maya collapse. The Maya did not disappear. They survived. They moved. They reorganized. The northern Maya cities of Chichen Itza and Uxmal flourished for centuries after the southern lowland collapse. The post-classic Maya of the Yucatan and highland Guatemala developed new political forms, new artistic traditions, new systems of knowledge and ceremony. It turns out that the Amazon was extensively modified by its human inhabitants, and that the terra preta soils found across large areas of Amazonia are the product of deliberate human action. The long-term incorporation of charcoal, bone, and organic material into the natural soils to create highly fertile, self-renewing agricultural lands. The people who created terra preta were not primitive. They were skilled environmental engineers who developed a soil improvement technology that modern agronomists are only now beginning to understand and replicate. Their legacy is not just in the soil. It is in the forests that grow on top of that soil. Forests that are unusually rich in useful food plants, in medicinal plants, in tree species that provide fiber, resin, oil, and would suggesting that the Amazon rainforest itself is in significant measure a product of human management over thousands of years. This is one of the most profound revisions of our understanding of pre-Columbian America that has occurred in recent decades. The Amazon is not a natural wilderness. It is a garden. It is the product of thousands of years of careful, deliberate, sophisticated management by the people who lived within it. And the loss of those people in the demographic catastrophe of the colonial period was also the loss of the knowledge necessary to continue that management. The result is the ecological complexity and fragility of the Amazon today, a richness created by human hands now threatened by the descendants of the people who destroyed the civilization that created it. There are also mysteries at the level of individual sites and individual cultures that resist easy explanation. Let us spend some time with a few of them. The Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, is one of the most extraordinary archaeological monuments in North America. A serpentine earthwork over 1,300 feet long, coiling through 5 distinct curves to terminate in a triple coiled tail, while its mouth gapes open around an oval mound traditionally interpreted as an egg. The Serpent Mound follows the curving edge of a ridge above Brush Creek in a way that suggests intimate knowledge of the landscape and deliberate spatial planning of a high order. The effigy is not functional in any obvious sense. It is not a burial mound. It does not enclose an area in the way the Hopewell geometric earthworks do. It is simply a serpent, enormous and sinuous, laid out on the landscape with a precision and an aesthetic intention that speaks to a deep and sophisticated symbolic vision. The date of the Serpent Mound has been revised multiple times. Earlier dating placed it in the Adena period around 1000 BCE. More recent dating, based on radiocarbon samples from the mound's core, places its construction around 900 CE, which would associate it with the Fort Ancient culture rather than the earlier Adena. But there are problems with the more recent dating as well, and the question of who built the Serpent Mound and why has not been definitively answered. The serpent as a symbolic figure appears across nearly every indigenous culture in North America, in forms ranging from the horned serpent or Uctina of the eastern woodlands to the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl of Mesoamerica, from the water serpents of the plains to the sea serpents of the Pacific Northwest coast. The serpent is a figure of power, of liminality, of the boundary between the worlds above and below, between the human and the cosmic, between the safe and the dangerous. In building the Serpent Mound, whoever did it was not just constructing an earthwork. They were instantiating a cosmological vision in the landscape itself, making the invisible visible on a scale that could be fully appreciated only from the sky. Which raises a question that is sometimes dismissed as too speculative, but that keeps returning in the literature. How did the builders of large-scale earthworks and effigy mounds intend them to be seen? The full form of a serpent mound, of a bird effigy mound like those of the effigy mound culture of Wisconsin and Iowa, can only be appreciated from above. Was there a cultural logic that treated the monuments as offerings to a sky-level perspective, as statements addressed to the beings or forces that inhabit the sky rather than to human viewers on the ground? Some researchers have suggested this. Others find the idea too speculative. But the question itself is worth asking because it points to a fundamentally different relationship between art, landscape, and cosmic order than the one familiar to European traditions. Let's talk about the effigy mounds. In the upper Mississippi Valley, particularly in present-day Wisconsin and Iowa, but also extending into Illinois, Minnesota, and beyond, there is a concentration of burial and effigy mounds that represent one of the most remarkable archaeological traditions in North America. The effigy mound culture, dating from roughly 600 to 1200 CE, built low earthen mounds in the shapes of animals, birds, and human figures across the rolling landscape of the upper Midwest. Panthers, bears, turtles, thunderbirds, water spirits. Figures that map the cosmological landscape of the woodland peoples onto the physical landscape of hills and valleys and waterways. There are estimated to have been between 12,000 and 15,000 effigy mounds originally built in the upper Midwest, though the vast majority have been destroyed by farming, urban development, and the construction of roads and buildings. Of those that remain, most are in parks and protected lands, preserved by a combination of federal law, state regulation, and the advocacy of Native American communities and archaeological organizations. The Ho-Chunk, or Winnebago, and other peoples of the region consider the effigy mounds sacred, the burial sites of their ancestors, and the objects of ongoing ceremonial responsibility. One of the most moving aspects of the effigy mound tradition is its intimacy with the landscape. The mounds are not placed in isolation. They are positioned in relation to each other, to the ridges and valleys and water sources of the landscape, and to the wider network of sacred sites that the earthwork builders understood as constituting their spiritual geography. To walk among the effigy mounds, as you can do at Effigy Mounds National Monument in northeastern Iowa, is to enter a landscape that has been made meaningful by human intentionality across more than 1,000 years. A landscape in which every hill and curve has been addressed by the builders, where the natural and the constructed are so intertwined that the boundary between them becomes unclear. This is one of the defining characteristics of pre-Columbian North American landscape practice, the tendency to work with rather than against the natural landscape, to find meaning in the existing forms of the earth, and to amplify or interpret that meaning through earthworks and other modifications rather than to impose a grid or a geometry on an indifferent terrain. It is a practice rooted in a cosmological understanding that sees the natural world as already meaningful, as already shot through with intention and agency, as a landscape that is not inert matter, but a community of beings with whom human beings are in constant relationship. This is not the same as saying that pre-Columbian peoples were primitive animists, unable to distinguish between the natural and the supernatural. It is to say that they operated within a different framework of understanding, one that did not draw the hard line between nature and culture, between the sacred and the practical, between the cosmological and the ecological that characterizes the dominant Western tradition. And in some ways, that different framework has proven more adequate to the actual complexity of the living world than the framework that replaced it. There is a conversation happening today between indigenous knowledge systems and Western science that may be one of the most productive intellectual developments of our time. Ecological knowledge accumulated by indigenous peoples over thousands of years of careful observation is proving to have genuine predictive and explanatory power in fields from fisheries management to forest ecology to climate adaptation. The traditional burning practices of California Indian peoples, suppressed by the federal government in the 19th and 20th centuries and now recognized as an essential tool for forest health and fire prevention, are one prominent example. The traditional ecological knowledge of Inuit communities, dismissed for decades by outside scientists, is now being incorporated into Arctic climate research in recognition that it captures patterns and relationships not visible in the short time scales of Western scientific observation. This is not romanticization. It is not the noble savage in a new form. It is the recognition that knowledge systems developed over thousands of years in intimate relationship with specific environments have accumulated insights that formal science, with its short time scales and its tendency toward abstraction, has often missed. And it is the recognition that the loss of those knowledge systems through the mechanisms of colonialism, assimilation, and cultural suppression has been a loss not just for the peoples whose knowledge was destroyed, but for all of humanity. Now, let us turn to some of the most genuinely mysterious and least explained episodes in the archaeology of North America. Episodes that the conventional narratives have either ignored or explained in ways that feel inadequate to the evidence. One of these involves the ancient copper culture of the Great Lakes. Between approximately 9,000 and 3,000 years ago, the indigenous peoples of the Lake Superior region were extracting and working native copper on a scale that was unprecedented anywhere in the ancient world. The Old Copper Complex, as archaeologists call this tradition, produced a stunning variety of objects from cold-hammered native copper. Tools and weapons including spear points, knives, awls, fish hooks, and axes, as well as ornamental objects including bracelets, beads, gorgets, and other personal adornments. The scale of copper extraction in the Lake Superior region during this period was enormous. Hundreds of ancient mining pits have been identified on Isle Royale and along the Keweenaw Peninsula, and estimates of the total copper extracted during the Old Copper period run into millions of pounds. This was industrial-scale mining, coordinated and sustained over thousands of years by organized communities with specialized knowledge, established networks of exchange, and the social and logistical capacity to manage a major extractive industry. And then around 3,000 years ago, the Old Copper Complex essentially stopped. The mining pits were abandoned. The copper working declined dramatically. The elaborately worked copper tools and ornaments that had characterized the tradition for thousands of years became much rarer. No one knows why. No catastrophic event has been identified that would explain the decline. No competing material appears to have displaced copper. It simply stopped, and the reasons are unknown. But here's where it gets stranger. The distinctive forms of old copper artifacts, spear points, awls, fish hooks, made in ways that closely resemble the old copper tradition, have been found in Bronze Age contexts in Europe. The similarities are close enough that several researchers have proposed that the copper extracted from Lake Superior somehow made its way to the Old World. That the Old Copper Complex was connected to a transatlantic trade in copper that supplied the Bronze Age civilizations of Europe and the Near East. This hypothesis is controversial, deeply controversial. The mainstream position is that the similarities are coincidental, that independent invention can explain parallel forms, and that there is no credible mechanism for transatlantic copper trade in the Bronze Age. The critics point out that isotope analysis of Bronze Age copper artifacts in Europe generally does not match the isotopic signature of Lake Superior copper, though the isotopic database is still being developed and the analysis is technically challenging. But the proponents of the connection point out that the sheer scale of copper extraction in the Great Lakes region, millions of pounds over thousands of years, and the apparent disappearance of that copper from the North American archaeological record in forms that would be expected if it had been used locally invites an explanation. Where did it all go? If it was used locally, we should see more of it. The old copper tradition produced beautiful and elaborate objects, but not in quantities that account for the extraction record. Something else was happening to the copper, and we do not know what. This is one of those mysteries where the absence of evidence is itself a kind of evidence, a gap in the record that points to something we have not yet understood. Another profound mystery involves the genetic and skeletal evidence for a population in the Americas that predates or exists alongside the ancestors of modern Native Americans, and that has no clear place in the standard migration model. Skull morphology studies conducted on the oldest skeletal remains from the Americas, remains dating to 10,000 years ago and older, have consistently shown that these ancient individuals had skull shapes that differ from modern Native American populations and that resemble populations from South and Southeast Asia, from the Pacific Islands, and from Australia more than they resemble modern East Asians or the descendants of the standard Beringian founding population. This finding, which has been replicated across multiple ancient skeletal assemblages from North and South America, has been interpreted in different ways. Some researchers argue that it reflects the physical variation within the founding population of the Americas, that the original migrants from Northeast Asia were more physically diverse than later populations became, as genetic drift reduced variation during the settlement of the continent. Others argue that it reflects multiple founding populations with different geographic origins, that the Americas were settled in more than one way from more than one source population. The ancient DNA evidence has complicated this picture in both directions. On one hand, the genetic data confirms that the vast majority of ancient and modern Native American ancestry traces back to Northeast Asia and the Beringian founder population. On the other hand, the population-wise signal found in certain Amazonian groups, the evidence of ancient contact with Polynesia in South America, and the occasional anomalous genetic signals in other ancient American populations all suggest that the full picture is more complex than the single wave model can accommodate. What we seem to be looking at is a primary founding population with Northeast Asian ancestry that arrived in the Americas sometime before 15,000 years ago, possibly much earlier, and that spread throughout the hemisphere, mixed with some component or components of earlier or different populations that we cannot fully characterize with current data, and then continued to develop in place for thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans. That earlier component is the ghost in the machine of American prehistory. It shows up in the morphology of ancient skulls. It shows up in the genetic signal of certain living populations. It shows up in the dates of sites that are too old to fit the standard model. It shows up in the biological and cultural complexity of the pre-Columbian Americas, which exceeds what the standard single-wave model would predict. Something happened in the deep prehistory of the Americas that we do not yet understand. And whatever it was, it left traces that are still visible if you know where to look. Let us talk about some of the less discussed aspects of pre-Columbian North American achievement. Things that are often overlooked in the standard accounts of indigenous history and that reveal the depth and sophistication of the civilizations that developed here. Astronomy. The indigenous peoples of North America were serious astronomers, not in the sense of casual stargazing, but in the sense of systematic long-term observation that produced calendrical knowledge of real precision. We have already mentioned the alignment of the Hopewell earthworks to the lunar cycle, and the astronomical orientation of the Chaco Canyon great houses. But these are just the most studied examples of practice that was widespread across the continent. Medicine wheel sites in the northern plains and the Rocky Mountains are stone structures built in the form of a wheel with a central cairn and radiating spokes. Some of them align to the summer solstice sunrise and to the heliacal risings of specific bright stars. The Bighorn Medicine Wheel in Wyoming, one of the largest and most studied of these sites, has alignments to the sunrise at the summer solstice and to the rising points of 3 bright stars, Aldebaran, Rigel, and Sirius, at times that bracket the summer months in a way that would have served as a precise agricultural and ceremonial calendar. The dates suggested by the stellar alignments run back as far as 2,000 years ago, though the site may have been used and modified over a much longer period. The astronomical knowledge implied by these alignments was not casual. The ability to track the heliacal rising of specific stars, to know when a given star would first become visible in the pre-dawn sky after its period of invisibility, and to use that knowledge as a calendrical marker requires systematic observation over many years, accurate record-keeping in some form, whether written or mnemonic, and the transmission of that knowledge across generations. This is not primitive stargazing. This is serious astronomy. The Pawnee of the Central Great Plains had one of the most elaborate stellar traditions in North America. Their ceremonial cycle was explicitly keyed to stellar observations, and certain Pawnee ceremonies could not be performed until specific stars had reached specific positions in the sky. The knowledge of the stars was held by specialist priests who transmitted it through initiatory training. It was embedded in a cosmological framework in which the stars were active agents in human affairs. Not just lights in the sky, but beings with intentions and powers that intersected with human life in specific and predictable ways. The Lakota, Ojibwe, Cherokee, Blackfoot, and dozens of other peoples had their own sophisticated astronomical traditions, their own systems for organizing celestial observation and integrating it with agricultural, ceremonial, and social practice. Most of these traditions were seriously disrupted by the colonial period. When the ceremonies that transmitted the knowledge were suppressed, the specialist practitioners died without fully trained successors, and the relationship between the living community and the cosmos encoded in the astronomical tradition was broken. What was lost when these traditions were disrupted? Not just a system of calendar keeping, a way of understanding the relationship between human beings and the universe they inhabit. A set of practices that placed human communities in a specific and meaningful relationship with the cycles of time and the movements of celestial bodies. A framework for making sense of the cosmos that was the product of thousands of years of careful observation and interpretation. Medicine and healing. The indigenous peoples of North America developed sophisticated medical traditions that were embedded in their understanding of the relationship between physical health, spiritual well-being, and ecological balance. These traditions varied enormously from culture to culture, and to speak of them as a single thing is to do violence to their diversity. But across that diversity, there were some consistent themes. The use of plant medicines in Native American healing traditions was sophisticated and pharmacologically effective. Many of the plants used in traditional Native American medicine have been analyzed by modern pharmacologists and found to contain compounds with genuine therapeutic activity. Willow bark, used by many native peoples to treat pain and fever, contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin. Echinacea, used by many plains peoples to treat infections, has been shown to have immunostimulant properties. Uvaursi, used by many peoples to treat urinary tract infections, contains arbutin, which has genuine antibacterial activity in the urinary tract. The list goes on and on. But traditional Native American medicine was not simply a collection of pharmacological remedies. It was a system of understanding and maintaining the relationship between human beings and the living world they inhabited. Disease was understood not just as a physical dysfunction, but as a disruption in a set of relationships between the individual and their community, between the community and the land, between the human and the non-human. Healing required addressing all of these levels of relationship, not just the physical symptoms. The healer, whether a shaman, a medicine man or woman, or a specialist in particular kinds of knowledge, was a person who understood these relationships and knew how to restore them when they were out of balance. This framework sounds metaphorical or spiritual to ears trained in the Western biomedical tradition, but it has a practical dimension that is only now being recognized by mainstream medicine. The recognition that human health is inseparable from community health, from environmental health, from the health of the social and ecological systems that support individual lives is one of the central insights of modern public health and ecological medicine. It was built into the healing traditions of the pre-Columbian Americas from the beginning. Agriculture. The agricultural systems developed by pre-Columbian North American peoples are another area of achievement that deserves far more recognition than it typically receives. The Three Sisters agriculture of the eastern woodlands and the northeast, the simultaneous cultivation of corn, beans, and squash, is one of the most productive and ecologically sophisticated intercropping systems ever devised. Corn provides a structure for the beans to climb. Beans fix nitrogen, fertilizing the soil for the corn and squash. Squash spreads along the ground, suppressing weeds and retaining moisture. The three plants together produce a nutritionally complete diet, with corn and squash providing carbohydrates and calories, and beans providing the protein and amino acids that corn lacks. The Three Sisters system fed millions of people across thousands of years. And its ecological logic, the way it integrates multiple plants in a mutually supportive system that improves the soil rather than depleting it, anticipates by centuries the principles of modern sustainable agriculture. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans developed irrigation systems of remarkable sophistication, moving water from sources miles away to terraced fields and locations that would otherwise have been too dry for agriculture. In the Southeast, the Mississippian peoples raised enormous quantities of corn on the rich bottomland soils of the major river valleys, supporting urban populations whose density rivaled anything in the contemporary medieval world. In the Pacific Northwest, the peoples of the coast managed the salmon runs with a combination of fishing practices and riparian management that maintained the productivity of those runs over thousands of years. All of these agricultural and ecological management practices required sophisticated knowledge accumulated over long periods of observation and experimentation. They were not simply traditional practices handed down unchanged from the ancestral past. They were dynamic, adaptive systems that were continuously being refined and updated in response to changing conditions. The knowledge embedded in them was held by communities and transmitted through practice, through ceremony, through oral tradition, and through the kinds of apprenticeship that are the only way to transmit knowledge that is fundamentally practical in nature. The loss of these agricultural and ecological knowledge systems through the disruptions of the colonial period was not just a cultural tragedy. It was an economic and ecological catastrophe. The destruction of the knowledge base that had supported the productivity and resilience of North American landscapes for thousands of years. There is one more aspect of pre-Columbian American history that demands attention. One that is perhaps the most philosophically profound and the most difficult to discuss without falling into either romanticization or dismissal. That is the question of how the indigenous peoples of the Americas understood themselves in relation to the cosmos, to time, to the sacred, and to the obligations that bind human beings to each other and to the living world. Different cultures had radically different answers to these questions, as different from each other as they were different from the answers that emerged from the great civilizations of the Old World. But certain themes recur across the diversity, themes that reflect the specific conditions of human life in the Americas and the specific ways in which those conditions shaped human consciousness. One of the most consistent of these themes is the understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear. In many Native American cosmologies, time is not an arrow moving from past to future, from beginning to end, from creation to apocalypse. It is a set of cycles nested within cycles, seasons within years, within longer cycles of natural and cosmic renewal. History is not progress. It is repetition and variation, the return of familiar patterns in new forms. The past is not gone. It is always returning, in dreams, in ceremony, in the living presence of ancestors in the landscape. This understanding of time has profound practical implications. If time is cyclical rather than linear, then the appropriate relationship to the past is not nostalgia or historical consciousness, but ceremonial engagement, the active practice of reconnection with the cycles and the beings that have always been present. The ceremony is not a commemoration of something that happened long ago. It is a participation in something that is always happening, a renewal of relationships that are never fully broken because they're not bounded by linear time. Another recurring theme is the understanding of the human community as extending beyond the human. In many Native American cosmological systems, the community that matters morally and spiritually is not just the community of human beings. It is the community of all beings, the trees and the animals and the rivers and the rocks and the ancestors and the unborn generations, all of whom have standing, all of whom have claims on human attention and respect, all of whom are involved in the ongoing project of maintaining the conditions for continued life. This extended community does not flatten all beings into equality. There are hierarchies and relationships of power and dependency in these systems, just as there are in the natural world. But the ethical framework is radically different from the one that treats the natural world as a resource to be exploited for human benefit. It is a framework in which human beings have obligations to the other members of their community, obligations that include gratitude, reciprocity, restraint, and the active maintenance of the conditions that allow all beings to flourish. These philosophical and ethical frameworks are not just interesting as intellectual curiosities. They are practically relevant to the ecological and social crises of the present moment in ways that philosophers and scientists and policymakers are only beginning to understand. There are legal and political movements in various countries around the world, including some indigenous-led movements in North and South America. They're seeking to extend legal personhood to ecosystems, rivers, forests, and other natural entities on the grounds that these entities have inherent value and inherent rights that should be recognized by law. These movements draw on both Western philosophical traditions and indigenous legal and ethical traditions that have long recognized the standing of non-human beings in the moral and political community. The most celebrated of these movements, the successful campaign to give the Whanganui River in New Zealand legal personhood in 2017, was explicitly grounded in Maori cosmological understanding of the river as an ancestor. In North America, similar initiatives are underway. The Yurok tribe of Northern California granted the Klamath River legal personhood in 2019. The Ohio River, the Colorado River, the Great Lakes have all been subjects of campaigns for legal recognition of natural rights. These are not just symbolic gestures. They are attempts to use the legal and political tools of the modern world to instantiate a different relationship between human beings and the natural world. a relationship in which the obligations run in both directions, and in which the long-term health of the ecosystem is recognized as a prerequisite for the long-term health of the human communities that depend on it. This is in essence the ancient understanding of the pre-Columbian peoples of North America, expressed in the language of modern law and politics. The circle is turning. We have traveled far together across this landscape of time and mystery and loss and survival. Let's come back to where we started, to the question that animates all of this. What really happened to America's first people across 12,000 years with no complete explanation? The honest answer is that we do not know. Not completely. Not with the kind of certainty that the textbooks sometimes project. What we know is partial, fragmentary, constantly being revised, and haunted by the awareness of how much has been lost, how much lies underwater, or underground or unexcavated, how much was burned or suppressed, or simply forgotten in the catastrophe of the colonial period. But what we do know is extraordinary. We know that human beings arrived in the Americas at least 15,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier, traveling by routes and for reasons we do not fully understand. We know that they developed over thousands of years an astonishing diversity of languages, cultures, social systems, agricultural practices, architectural traditions, astronomical knowledge systems, and philosophical frameworks. We know that they built cities and earthworks of a scale and sophistication that rivals anything produced by the contemporary civilizations of the Old World. We know that they survived one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history and emerged from it not as the vanishing race their destroyers imagined them to be, but as living, creative, resilient communities insisting on their continued existence and the relevance of their knowledge to the challenges of the present. And we know that the story is not over. The mysteries are not resolved. New sites are being excavated. New genetic data is being analyzed. New oral traditions are being recorded and taken seriously by scholars who would have dismissed them a generation ago. The picture is becoming more complex, more nuanced, more surprising with each passing year. What happened to America's first people is still happening. They are still here. And the story they tell about the deep past of this continent, about what it means to live in relationship with the land and the living world, about what is possible when human communities commit themselves to the long-term health of their place in the cosmos, is one of the most important stories being told in the world today. It is a story worth losing sleep over, or perhaps more appropriately, a story worth staying awake to. Even as the night grows deep and the questions settle into the silence around you. The continent itself is a mystery. Its mountains and rivers and deserts and forests have been the backdrop for 12,000 years of human ingenuity and suffering and persistence and creation. And beneath the surface, in the soil and the stone and the water, the record of those 12,000 years is still there, waiting to be read, waiting to be understood, waiting to be acknowledged. There are sites yet to be discovered. There are DNA sequences yet to be analyzed. There are oral traditions yet to be fully heard. There are questions yet to be asked. And somewhere in the space between what we know and what we do not know, between the evidence and the silence, between the visible and the submerged, between the documented and the forgotten, the real story of America's first people is still unfolding. That is the nature of mystery. It does not resolve. It deepens. And in the deepening, it opens something in us, some capacity for wonder and humility and attention. That is perhaps the most important thing the long human story of this continent has to teach. We live on ancient ground. Every patch of North American earth that humans have ever stood on was stood on before by people with their own stories, their own knowledge, their own ways of being in the world. Their presence is not gone. It is layered into the landscape. encoded in the plants and animals that still live here, preserved in the traditions of the peoples who are still here, and waiting in the earth for those willing to look and to listen. 12,000 years is a long time. It is long enough for languages to form and diverge and go extinct. It is long enough for cities to rise and fall and be forgotten. It is long enough for genetic markers to drift and spread and cluster in ways that trace the movements of populations across a hemisphere. It is long enough for the sea to rise 400 feet and drown entire chapters of civilization. It is long enough for the memories of catastrophe to become cosmological narratives, for history to become myth, for the specific to become the universal. And it is not long enough to exhaust the mystery. Not by a long way. The first Americans left their mark on this land in ways both visible and invisible. In the great earthworks and the stone chambers and the effigy mounds and the cliff dwellings and the subterranean kivas and the petroglyphs carved into canyon walls. In the terra preta soils of the Amazon and the irrigation ditches of the Southwest and the fish weirs of the Pacific Northwest coast. In the genes of the people who still live here and the people scattered across the world who carry in their blood the traces of ancient migrations that the textbooks have barely begun to document. In the languages spoken by millions of people today that connect them to a linguistic heritage so old that linguists can barely see its origins. In the ceremonies that still name the stars and greet the returning seasons and honor the obligations between the living and the dead. The mystery is not behind us. It is all around us. We're living inside it. And if that thought keeps you awake tonight, lingering at the edge of sleep, turning over questions that have no easy answers, then perhaps that is exactly the right response. Because the pre-Columbian Americas were not a simple story. They were not a prologue to the American story that the textbooks tell. They were a story in themselves, rich and complex and tragic and magnificent. A story still being told, still being uncovered, still being understood. Rest now if you can. Tomorrow, the ground beneath your feet will still be ancient. The questions will still be there. And somewhere in the distance, in the curve of a river valley, or the shadow of an earthwork mound, or the alignment of standing stones toward a solstice sunrise, the first Americans are still asking us to pay attention. They are still here, and so are the mysteries they left behind. But let's not stop here, because the story has more corridors, more chambers, more passages into darkness and into light. Let's go deeper. There is a region of the American continent that has produced some of the most disturbing and most profound archaeological evidence of ancient human presence anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And it has done so quietly, far from the major university centers, far from the well-funded excavation programs, in a landscape so remote and so geologically active that the evidence it contains is always threatening to be swallowed back into the earth that produced it. That region is the coastal Pacific Northwest, the land of the Haida, the Tsimshian, the Tlingit, the Kwakwaka'wakw, and dozens of other peoples whose cultures represent one of the most sophisticated expressions of human life in the pre-Columbian world. The Pacific Northwest coast is a place of extraordinary ecological richness. The meeting of cold northern waters and the warm California current just offshore produces one of the most productive marine environments on Earth. The rivers that cut through the coast range carry enormous runs of salmon. 5, 6, sometimes 7 species, returning each year to spawn in the rivers and streams of their birth. The forests of cedar and spruce and Douglas fir that cover the slopes above those rivers are among the largest living biomasses on the planet. The result is a landscape of almost unimaginable abundance. A landscape that allowed the peoples who live there to build some of the most complex hunter-gatherer societies in human history without agriculture. without the need to cultivate the land, simply by managing and harvesting the extraordinary productivity of what the land and sea already provided. The peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast built large rectangular houses of split cedar planks, some of them 100 feet long and capable of housing an extended family group of 40 or 50 people. They carved cedar into ocean-going canoes capable of hunting whales miles offshore and of trading along hundreds of miles of coastline. They developed a carving tradition that transformed the surfaces of almost every object they made, from the great totem poles that recorded the genealogies and mythic histories of the families who raised them, to the everyday bowls and spoons and boxes that were the material apparatus of daily life, into expressions of a visual language of extraordinary sophistication and beauty. The artistic tradition of the Northwest coast is one of the most immediately recognizable of any pre-Columbian culture, with its distinctive use of form line. The curving black outline that defines and connects the visual elements of Northwest coast design in a system of representation that encodes complex information about identity, kinship, and cosmological relationship in a visual grammar that takes years to fully master. Northwest coast art is not decorative in the superficial sense. It is a language, and every surface it adorns is a text in that language, speaking simultaneously to human viewers and to the supernatural beings whose attention the art is meant to attract. The social organization of the Northwest Coast peoples was among the most complex of any non-agricultural society in the world. Hereditary rank was crucial. The distinction between nobles, commoners, and slaves was marked and maintained by elaborate protocols of deference and display. Wealth in the form of blankets, canoes, food, slaves, and other valuables was accumulated by the noble families and periodically redistributed through the potlatch ceremony, a feast at which the host demonstrated the extent of his wealth and generosity by giving it all away, and in which guests witnessed and validated the host's claims to ancestral titles, territories, and ceremonial prerogatives. The potlatch was not just a party. It was a legal and political institution, a way of recording and validating social relationships in a society without writing, a way of redistributing wealth from the successful to the less successful that prevented the kind of absolute impoverishment that might otherwise have divided the community irreparably. The Canadian government banned the potlatch in 1885, identifying it correctly as a central pillar of Northwest Coast society and believing incorrectly that destroying it would accelerate the assimilation of Northwest Coast peoples into Euro-Canadian society. The ban remained in effect until 1951, 66 years during which the ceremony was driven underground, practiced in secret at the risk of imprisonment, and maintained in diminished form by the determination of the people who understood what would be lost if it were allowed to die. The potlatch survived. It is practiced today across the Northwest Coast by peoples who insist on the continuing relevance of the values it embodies, the obligations of generosity, the importance of witnessing, the recognition that wealth is a social responsibility rather than a personal possession. These are not archaic values. They are values that the modern world is slowly and painfully rediscovering as it confronts the consequences of unchecked economic inequality and ecological destruction. The archaeology of the Northwest Coast is in many ways still in its early stages, partly because so much of the most relevant material lies underwater. The coastline of the Northwest has experienced significant tectonic uplift in some areas and subsidence in others, and the sea level changes of the post-glacial period flooded vast areas of what would have been the most intensively occupied parts of the ancient coast. The shell middens and village sites of the earliest inhabitants of the Northwest Coast lie beneath dozens of feet of water along the submerged shoreline that extended far beyond the present coast during the period when sea levels were lower and the Bering Land Bridge was still open. What little we do know of the deep pre-Columbian history of the northwest coast suggests occupation going back at least 13,000 years, to the period just after the last glacial maximum, when the first inhabitants of the region would have been able to exploit the ice-free coastal environments that form the southern end of the Kelp Highway. The genetic diversity of Northwest Coast peoples, which is greater than that of most other Native American populations, is consistent with the hypothesis that this region was an important early refugium during the period when much of the continent was still covered by ice, a place where multiple early migrant lineages survived and mixed before spreading inland as the glaciers retreated. The oral traditions of the Northwest Coast peoples speak of a time when the world was different, when the sea was higher or lower, when the land was differently configured, when great floods and great droughts and great upheavals of the earth reshaped the landscape in ways that can still be recognized in the landforms of the present coastline. These traditions have been increasingly taken seriously by geologists and geographers who recognize that they may encode genuine memories of natural events that occurred thousands of years ago, preserved through the mechanisms of oral transmission that can, in the right cultural conditions, maintain accurate information across vast stretches of time. One particularly striking example is the oral tradition of the Haida and other Northwest Coast peoples, describing the great tsunami that destroyed villages on the coast in a catastrophic event that geologists have dated to around 1700 CE through the analysis of tsunami deposits in coastal sediments. The traditions describe the event in vivid detail: the sudden withdrawal of the sea, the enormous wave that followed, the destruction of coastal settlements, the survival of those who fled to high ground. The geological and the traditional accounts are strikingly consistent, suggesting that the traditions do indeed preserve accurate memory of a real event. How far back can oral traditions go? Can they really preserve accurate information across thousands of years? The answer depends on the specific cultural mechanisms for transmission, the degree of formalization of the traditions, the social importance attached to accuracy, and the stability of the cultural context in which the traditions are maintained. In cultures where the traditions are embedded in ceremony, where specialists are trained over years to reproduce them accurately, where the social consequences of error are serious, oral traditions can maintain a surprising fidelity over very long time scales. The oral traditions of the Aboriginal Australians have recently been shown to encode accurate geographical information about the flooding of the Australian coast that occurred at the end of the last ice age, some 10,000 years ago. Similar claims have been made for certain Northwest Coast traditions. If these claims are correct, they suggest that oral tradition is a far more reliable vehicle for long-term knowledge transmission than the Western academic tradition has been willing to acknowledge. This has implications for how we approach the oral traditions of pre-Columbian North American peoples in general, not as folklore to be dismissed or as mythology to be interpreted symbolically, but as possible repositories of genuine historical and geographical knowledge that deserves to be taken seriously alongside the archaeological and genetic evidence. Let us move across the continent to a region that has produced some of the most extraordinary and some of the most puzzling evidence of ancient human activity anywhere in North America. Let's go to the Great Basin. The Great Basin is the vast arid interior of the American West, bounded by the Sierra Nevada on the west, the Rocky Mountains on the east, the Columbia Plateau on the north, and the Mojave Desert on the south. It is a region of extreme environments, of salt flats and alkaline lakes and playa basins where water collects briefly after rare rains and then evaporates, leaving behind salt and soda and the bones of animals that came to drink. It is also a region that has preserved in its dry sediments and its deep caves some of the most ancient organic materials in North America. At Spirit Cave in Nevada, a naturally mummified human body was found in a dry cave in 1940 and was for decades believed to be relatively recent. In 1994, radiocarbon dating established that the Spirit Cave mummy was approximately 9,400 years old, making it one of the oldest human mummies in North America. The man's clothing, woven from marsh plants and bird skins, was preserved. His tools were preserved. His body itself was preserved in extraordinary detail. The Spirit Cave mummy became the center of a prolonged legal and scientific controversy when the Falun Paiute Shoshone tribe, whose traditional territory includes a cave, claimed him as an ancestor under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and requested his repatriation for reburial. Scientists who wanted to conduct further analyses, including ancient DNA testing, objected to the repatriation on the grounds that the mummy was scientifically important and that his relationship to modern tribal peoples had not been established. The case dragged on for years, and it illuminated fundamental tensions between scientific and indigenous understandings of the past, between the desire to extract information from ancient human remains and the obligations of descendant communities to their ancestors, between the imperatives of scientific knowledge and the rights of indigenous peoples to determine the fate of what they regard as their kin. In 2016, ancient DNA analysis established that the Spirit Cave mummy was indeed ancestrally related to modern Great Basin peoples, and he was repatriated and reburied in 2016, ending a controversy that had lasted more than 2 decades. The Great Basin is also home to some of the most extensive and most enigmatic rock art in North America. The petroglyphs and pictographs found on the rock surfaces of the Great Basin range in age from very recent to possibly 10,000 years old. The older images include abstract geometric forms, dots, lines, spirals, and the distinctive form known as the curvilinear groove, a meandering line in desert varnish that appears at sites across the region. More recent images include representational figures, animals, human forms, and complex narrative scenes. The meaning of these images is contested. Some researchers see them as primarily shamanistic in origin, the products of altered states of consciousness in which the geometric forms represent the entoptic phenomena, the visual patterns generated within the nervous system itself that are common to all human altered states. Others see them as territorial markers, as hunting magic, as astronomical records, as clan symbols, or as narrative art in the conventional sense. Indigenous peoples of the region have their own interpretations, which vary considerably, and which are sometimes shared with outsiders, and sometimes kept private as sacred knowledge. Whatever their specific meanings in specific contexts, the rock art sites of the Great Basin are among the most direct connections we have to the inner lives of the people who created them. Unlike the material culture of everyday life, which reflects practical needs, rock art reflects intentionality, the desire to make visible something invisible, to mark a place with meaning, to communicate across the boundary between the human and the sacred, or across the boundary between the present and the future. The people who made these images did not know that 10,000 years later, strangers from across the ocean would come and try to understand them. They were not making messages for us. They were making them for themselves, for their community, for their gods, for the landscape itself. Though we can look at them now, that we can feel the presence of the humans who made them, the weight of their hands on the rock, the attention of their minds focused on the act of creation, is one of the extraordinary gifts that the dry preservation of the Great Basin has given us. Let us go south now to the landscape that connects the two great traditions of pre-Columbian North America, the culture of the Southwest, and the cultures of Mesoamerica. Let us go to the borderlands. The Sonoran Desert and the landscapes that surround it constitute one of the most culturally complex zones in the pre-Columbian world. Here are the traditions of the Southwest: the Hohokam of the Salt and Gila River valleys, the Mogollon of the mountains of southern New Mexico and Arizona, the Patayan of the lower Colorado, merged and interacted with the northernmost extensions of Mesoamerican culture, the Ball Quartz and the Copper Bells and the Macaws that arrive from the south carrying with them elements of a cosmological system rooted in the high civilizations of Mexico. The Hohokam are perhaps the most extraordinary example of engineering achievement in pre-Columbian North America and north of Mexico. Living in a desert where the average annual rainfall is barely 7 inches, they built an irrigation system that at its maximum extent covered more than 500 miles of canals, directing the flow of the Salt and Gila rivers across hundreds of square miles of desert to create one of the most productive agricultural systems in pre-Columbian North America. The main canals of the Hohokam system were 20 feet wide and 10 feet deep. They were precisely graded to maintain a flow that would carry water but not silt. They were maintained by organized labor over hundreds of years. The engineering precision of the Hohokam canals is remarkable by any standard. Modern canal engineers confronted with the remains of the Hohokam system when they began constructing irrigation infrastructure for the Phoenix metropolitan area in the late 19th century found that they could simply dredge out the ancient canal beds and use them as the foundations for the modern system. The Hohokam had already identified the optimal routes, the optimal grades, the optimal points of diversion. The modern city of Phoenix is in part built on the infrastructure of a civilization that flourished 1,200 years ago. And then the Hohokam declined around 1300 CE. The large platform mound settlements that had characterized the classic Hohokam period began to be abandoned. The canal system contracted. The population dispersed. By the time European explorers reached the region in the 16th century, the great Hohokam centers were ruins, their canals silted and dry, their platform mounds eroding back into the desert. The descendants of the Hohokam are generally identified as the modern Acamaloatam, the Pima people of the Gila River Valley, and the Tohono-O'odham of the Sonoran Desert. Their oral traditions speak of the Hohokam as the Hugum, the people who are gone, and describe the collapse of the ancient civilization in terms that blend historical memory with cosmological interpretation. They were people like us, the traditions say, but they forgot their obligations to the land and to each other. They took more than they should have taken. They lost the balance, and so they are gone. This interpretation has a haunting resonance with what the archaeological record shows. The evidence from the classic Hohokam period, the period just before the collapse, shows increasing social stratification, with the elite at the top of the platform mounds accumulating luxury goods and exotic materials, while the general population lived in increasingly crowded and apparently stressed conditions. There is evidence of conflict and possibly of coercion. The elaborate ball courts that had characterized the pre-classic Hohokam and that had served as centers of communal ceremony and presumably of community solidarity were abandoned or fell out of use. The social cement that had held the system together was dissolving. The collapse of the Hohokam, like the collapse of Cahokia, like the abandonment of Chaco Canyon, like the dissolution of the Hopewell Exchange Network, looks in retrospect like the product of a particular kind of social trajectory. Complexity increases. Hierarchy deepens. The mechanisms that once distributed resources and maintained community solidarity are captured by elites. The system becomes brittle, and then some combination of external stress, ecological degradation, climatic change, internal conflict tips it over the edge. This trajectory is familiar. It is in fact disturbingly familiar. and the oral traditions of the peoples who live in the aftermath of these collapses, who describe them in terms of lost balance, of forgotten obligations, of excessive taking and inadequate giving, reflect a wisdom about the dynamics of complex social systems that academic scholarship has taken centuries to begin to articulate. There's a lesson in these stories. Whether or not we choose to hear it is another matter. Let us talk about something that rarely appears in the standard accounts of pre-Columbian North America, but that is increasingly recognized as one of the most important dimensions of pre-Columbian life. That is the question of violence. Pre-Columbian North America was not a peaceful paradise. Violence was endemic in many regions and periods. Warfare between groups was common. Raiding, captive taking, and massacre are documented in the archaeological record for many periods and many cultures. The skeletal evidence from numerous sites shows individuals who died from projectile wounds, blunt force trauma, and in some cases mutilation and cannibalism. The fortifications and defensive architecture found at sites across the continent from the Hopewell period onward testify to the threat that organized violence posed to many communities. The image of the peaceful Indian living in harmony with nature and with other peoples is a myth and not a neutral one. It has historically been used both to romanticize native cultures and to obscure the real complexity of pre-Columbian societies, their politics, their conflicts, their internal contradictions. The people of the pre-Columbian Americas were fully human, which means they were capable of both extraordinary creativity and extraordinary cruelty. But the nature and scale of pre-Columbian violence need to be understood in context. The violence that occurred within the pre-Columbian world was violence between peoples who shared the continent, who had developed mechanisms for managing conflict, who conducted their wars within frameworks of cultural meaning and social constraint that limited their destructiveness in various ways. The violence that European colonization brought to the Americas was categorically different. It was violence aimed at the elimination of whole peoples, the destruction of whole cultures, the permanent dispossession of whole nations. It was genocidal in its intent, in its methods, and in its effects. The recognition of the violence within pre-Columbian cultures does not mitigate or excuse the violence of colonization. It does not create a false equivalence between the ordinary violence of human social life and the systematic violence of colonial conquest. What it does is complicate the story in ways that are ultimately more respectful of the peoples involved, because it treats them as fully human, fully complex, fully capable of both violence and transcendence, rather than as either noble savages or bloodthirsty primitives. The full complexity of pre-Columbian American life includes its violence, its hierarchy, its exploitation, its environmental degradation in some times and places. It also includes its extraordinary artistic and intellectual achievement, its sophisticated management of complex ecosystems, its development of political philosophies that are still relevant to the challenges of governance, its maintenance of cultural traditions of remarkable depth and beauty across thousands of years. Both aspects are real. Both deserve to be acknowledged. Let us turn to another dimension of pre-Columbian life that is often overlooked in the standard accounts: the dimension of trade and exchange. The pre-Columbian Americas were not a collection of isolated, self-sufficient communities. They were connected across enormous distances by networks of exchange that moved goods, ideas, people, technologies, and religious practices across the entire continent. We have already mentioned the Hopewell Exchange Network, which moved exotic materials from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes and from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast. But the Hopewell Network is just one example of a phenomenon that characterized North American life from its earliest period. The most ancient evidence of long-distance exchange in North America comes from the Paleo-Indian period, the earliest period of documented human occupation. Clovis points, the distinctive fluted spear points associated with the earliest well-documented culture in North America, have been found made of materials that were quarried hundreds of miles from where the finished points were discovered. Someone was moving either the raw material or the finished tools across distances of 500 miles or more than 12,000 years ago. By the Archaic period, 5,000 to 8,000 years ago, exchange networks had become more elaborate. Copper from the Great Lakes was moving to the Gulf Coast. Marine shells from the Gulf were moving to the Ohio Valley. Chert from specific high-quality quarries was being distributed across wide areas. The materials themselves testify to the existence of social networks capable of maintaining relationships of exchange across vast distances and across the boundaries between different language groups and cultural traditions. The mechanisms of exchange in pre-Columbian North America were varied and complex. Gift exchange between allied communities was one mechanism, with the reciprocal obligations of gift-giving creating and maintaining social relationships between groups that might be separated by hundreds of miles. Trade in the more commercial sense, the direct exchange of goods for goods or goods for services, also occurred, particularly in the periodic aggregations that brought groups together at resource-rich locations. The potlatch ceremonies of the Northwest Coast were one form of exchange ceremony. The trading fairs held at certain river junctions and mountain passes during the periods when different groups converged for seasonal hunting or gathering were another. The most elaborate exchange systems in pre-Columbian North America were those associated with the major ceremonial centers of the Hopewell and Mississippian traditions. The great earthwork complexes of the Hopewell and the large platform mound sites of the Mississippian served as gathering points where communities from across wide areas came together for ceremonies that involved the exchange of sacred materials and the negotiation of social relationships. The exotic materials recovered from burials at these sites, copper and shell and mica and obsidian and galena and shark's teeth and alligator skulls, testify to the geographic reach of these exchange networks and to the importance of exotic materials as symbols of sacred power and social prestige. The turquoise trade of the Southwest is another example of the complexity and reach of pre-Columbian exchange systems. Turquoise from mines in New Mexico and Arizona moved south into Mexico, where it was prized as a sacred material by the Aztec and other Mesoamerican peoples. The caches of turquoise recovered from sites in the Valley of Mexico, including the Great Temple Precinct of Tenochtitlan, contain pieces that geological analysis has traced to specific mines in New Mexico and Arizona. Turquoise was moving from the southwest to central Mexico, a distance of more than 1,000 miles, as part of a trade system that also moved copper bells, macaw feathers, and other luxury goods northward in exchange. This trade network was not just an exchange of material goods. It was a conduit for the movement of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. The ball courts that appear in the Hohokam tradition of the Arizona desert were a technology introduced from Mesoamerica, along with the rubber balls and the specific rules of the game that the courts were designed for. The platform mounds of the Mississippian tradition may have been influenced by the similar structures of Mesoamerican ceremonial centers. The iconographic motifs that appear on Mississippian pottery, copper, and shell objects, the serpentine figures, the birdman, the hand and eye symbols, show clear connections to Mesoamerican iconographic traditions, though the exact nature and mechanism of that connection are still debated. This cultural interchange across the long border between North America and Mesoamerica is one of the least studied and most important dimensions of pre-Columbian American history. The boundary between what we call North America and what we call Mesoamerica is a modern one imposed by the accident of where the Spanish colonial boundary of New Spain happened to fall. In the pre-Columbian world, that boundary did not exist in the same way. Peoples moved across it, ideas moved across it, technologies moved across it, and the civilizations that developed on both sides of it were in complex, ongoing dialogue with each other in ways that we are only beginning to understand. Let us look more carefully at one of the most significant and most mysterious of these cross-border connections: the appearance of the macaw in the pre-Columbian Southwest. Scarlet macaws are birds native to the tropical forests of Mexico and Central America. They do not survive in the wild in the deserts of the American Southwest. And yet the ruins of Pacoime, or Casas Grandes, in the Mexican state of Chihuahua, contain the remains of hundreds of scarlet macaws, along with the specialized pens and aviaries where they were apparently bred in captivity. Pacoime is a large and sophisticated site dating to roughly 900 to 1400 CE, with multi-story masonry structures, an elaborate system of water management, ball courts, platform mounds, copper bells, and evidence of long-distance trade with both the Southwest Puebloan traditions to the north and the Mesoamerican traditions to the south. Scarlet macaw remains have been found at Chaco Canyon and at other major Southwest sites, along with the remains of copper bells of type made in West Mexico, and of conch shell trumpets whose species range is limited to Gulf of California and the Pacific coast of Mexico. These materials were moving north along a corridor of exchange that connected the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts with the high plateau civilizations of West Mexico, and that carried with it elements of a ceremonial complex whose roots were in Mesoamerica, but whose expressions in the Southwest were distinctly local and original. The people who managed this corridor were not just traders. They were cultural brokers, people who understood the symbolic systems of both the North and the South, who could translate between the cosmological frameworks of the Puebloan and Mogollon traditions and those of West Mexico, who maintained the social and political relationships that kept the goods and ideas moving along the corridor across multiple generations. We know almost nothing about who these people were, where they lived, how they were organized, or what happened to them when the corridor collapsed with the decline of Pacoime in the 14th and 15th centuries. The silence that surrounds the Pacoime corridor is representative of a wider silence in the pre-Columbian record of the borderland zone. There are sites in this region that have not been excavated, traditions that have not been studied, connections that have not been traced. The borderland between the United States and Mexico, which is today one of the most politically charged landscapes on Earth, was in the pre-Columbian world a zone of intense cultural creativity and exchange, and it deserves far more scholarly attention than it has received. Let us now go back to the very beginning one more time and ask a question that we have been approaching throughout this entire journey, but that we have not yet asked directly. Who were the very first Americans? Not in the sense of what language they spoke, or what tools they made, or what gods they worshipped. In the most fundamental sense, where did they come from? What was the full range of their ancestors? And when they first stood on the shore of a continent that no human had ever seen before, what did they see and what did they think? We cannot know the last part. We can only imagine. But the first part, the question of their ancestry and their origins, is one that modern genetics is beginning to illuminate in ways that are both exciting and humbling. The picture that is emerging from ancient DNA analysis of the oldest human remains in the Americas and from comparative analysis of the genomes of modern Native American populations is a picture of considerable complexity. The founding population of the Americas appears to have been descended from a group that separated from the common ancestor of all East Asians sometime before 20,000 years ago, and that spent a period of possibly several thousand years in the region of Beringia, the Broad Land Bridge, and adjacent areas that connected Northeast Asia to Alaska during the glacial maximum. During this Beringian standstill, as some researchers have called it, the founding population accumulated the genetic differences that distinguish it from all other populations in the world. But within that founding population, there were already multiple lineages, multiple lines of descent that would diverge as the population spread south into the Americas. The primary split appears to have been between the ancestors of the Na Dene and Eskimo Aleut-speaking peoples who remained in the far north, and whose distinctive genetic profile distinguishes them from other Native Americans, and the ancestors of all other Native American peoples who spread rapidly south and eventually populated the entire hemisphere. On top of this primary divergence, there are secondary layers of complexity. The population-wise signal in certain Amazonian groups, suggesting ancestry from a population more closely related to Australasians than to East Asians. The evidence of Polynesian contact and genetic contribution in parts of coastal South America. The possible contribution of North Pacific populations with connections to the Jaman of Japan and some Northwest Coast peoples. And the background noise of thousands of years of movement and mixture within the Americas as populations spread, diverged, came back into contact, merged, and separated again. The full genetic history of the pre-Columbian Americas is still being written, one ancient genome at a time. Each new ancient DNA analysis adds another data point, clarifies some relationships, complicates others, and occasionally produces a completely unexpected result that forces a revision of existing models. It is among the most active and most exciting frontiers in human population genetics today. But genetics can only tell us so much. It can tell us who was related to whom, who shared ancestry with whom, which populations were in contact with each other, and when. It cannot tell us what those populations thought, what they believed, what they hoped for, what they feared, what gave their lives meaning. For that, we have to turn to the archaeological record and to the oral traditions and to the artistic expressions that the pre-Columbian peoples of North America left behind. And what those records tell us across their enormous diversity and their enormous time depth is something profound. It is that human beings, wherever they have lived, whatever the specific circumstances of their existence, have been asking the same fundamental questions. Where do we come from? What are we doing here? How should we live? What happens when we die? And how should we treat each other and the world we inhabit? The answers that the pre-Columbian peoples of North America developed to these questions were as varied as the environments they lived in and the histories they carried. But they were genuine answers, hard-won through thousands of years of experience and reflection, embedded in traditions of ceremony and story and art and practice that gave them a depth and a resilience that the superficial treatment they typically receive in popular accounts cannot begin to convey. These answers are not irrelevant to us. They are not museum pieces, interesting only as artifacts of the past. They are living traditions, maintained and developed by living communities. And they speak to questions that are urgently relevant to the present moment. Questions about how to maintain the health of complex ecosystems. Questions about how to organize communities in ways that are equitable and sustainable. Questions about how to transmit knowledge across generations in a world that changes faster than any single human life can track. Questions about how to remain connected to the places and the ancestors and the non-human beings with whom we share the world. The pre-Columbian Americas were not a golden age. They were not a utopia. They were a human world, full of the usual mixture of greatness and failure, creativity and destruction, wisdom and folly. But they were also a world in which certain things were understood that we are only now painfully relearning. Things about the finitude of natural resources and the need to manage them carefully. Things about the importance of social solidarity and the dangers of extreme hierarchy. Things about the obligations that bind the living to the dead and the unborn. things about the relationship between human communities and the other communities of life with whom we share the world. The story of what really happened to America's first people is not just a story about the past. It is a story about the future, about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget, about what we choose to protect and what we choose to destroy, about what kinds of knowledge we value and what kinds we dismiss, about whose stories we tell and whose we leave in silence. 12,000 years. That is how long human beings have been living in the Americas by the most conservative estimates. And in those 12,000 years, they built and learned and remembered and created on a scale that we have barely begun to understand. The evidence is in the earth and in the genes and in the oral traditions and in the art and in the landscape itself. It is waiting to be read, and reading it carefully with humility and attention and the willingness to revise our assumptions is one of the most important intellectual tasks facing the modern world. Because we're not separate from the story. We are inside it. The ground we stand on is ancient. The problems we face are old. And the knowledge we need to face them may be in significant measure already present, encoded in the traditions and the practices and the ways of knowing that the pre-Columbian peoples of North America developed over 12 millennia of determined and creative human presence on this remarkable continent. Let's hold that thought as the night deepens. Let's sit alongside the images we have gathered in the course of this long journey. The great earthworks of the Ohio Valley aligned to the moon. The cliff dwellings of Monte Verde perched above the canyon. The canals of the Hohokam threading the desert with water. The salmon weirs of the Pacific Northwest coast, carefully tended across generations. The cave paintings of the deep ancient past, lit by torchlight in chambers no sunlight ever reached. The Serpent Mound, uncoiling across its hilltop in Ohio. The shell middens of the Gulf Coast. The effigy mounds of Wisconsin. The medicine wheels of the Northern Plains. The turquoise mines of New Mexico. The macaw aviaries of Pequim. The libraries of Maya knowledge reduced to ash at Monte. The languages that still carry in their grammar and their vocabulary and their metaphors the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of life in specific places on this earth. All of this is what happened to America's first people. Not just disease and conquest and dispossession. Not just loss and silence and forgetting. All of it. The 12,000 years of building and creating and knowing and surviving and fighting and trading and praying and dancing and burying the dead with care and raising the children with intention and asking the old questions in new forms and finding in each generation enough of what they needed to keep going. They kept going, and so did their descendants. And so, in our own way, in our own time, with our own questions and our own need to understand the ground we stand on, must we? The continent holds its secrets. Some of them may never be fully revealed. The waters have risen over too many ancient shores. The fires have burned too many books. The silence has lasted too long in too many places. But some of the secrets can still be found by those willing to look and to listen and to sit with the discomfort of not knowing as long as it takes for the not knowing to teach us something important. That is the gift that the mystery of America's first people offers. Not answers exactly, but the right questions. And the right questions held long enough and seriously enough are where all real understanding begins. Rest well. The questions will still be there in the morning. And so will the ancient ground, patient and full of memory, waiting for someone to ask it what it knows. There is one more territory we have not yet crossed, one more landscape we have not yet entered, and it may be the most consequential of all for understanding what really happened across these 12,000 years. It is the territory of memory itself, of how the pre-Columbian peoples of North America remembered, preserved, and transmitted knowledge in the absence of writing, and of what that means for our ability to understand them now. Every culture in the world has developed methods for transmitting knowledge across time. The Western tradition, as it developed from the ancient Mediterranean through the medieval and modern periods, came to rely increasingly on written text as its primary vehicle for knowledge preservation. Books, archives, libraries, the accumulation of written records across generations. This is how Western civilization stores what it knows and passes it to the future. It is a powerful system. It allows the accumulation of knowledge on a scale and at a rate that no purely oral tradition can match. It allows exact reproduction of texts across centuries and across distances. It makes possible the kind of cumulative science and scholarship that has transformed the material conditions of human life in the past few centuries. But it is not the only way, and it is not without its own forms of loss and limitation. The pre-Columbian peoples of North America, most of whom did not have writing in the conventional sense, developed extraordinarily sophisticated systems for transmitting knowledge through performance, through ceremony, through song, through story, through the material forms of art and architecture, through the spatial organization of settlements and landscapes, and through the social structures and practices of everyday life. These systems had different strengths and different weaknesses than writing, and understanding them is essential to understanding the cultures that produce them. One of the most powerful of these systems was ceremonial performance. The great ceremonies of the pre-Columbian world, the Lakota Sun Dance, the Hopi Kachina ceremonies, the Haudenosaunee Condolence Ceremony, the Navajo Healing Chants, the Northwest Coast Potlatch, and hundreds of others, were not just spiritual events. They were technologies of knowledge transmission, multi-day performances in which information about cosmology, history, ecology, social relationships, and ethical obligations was encoded in song, dance, narrative, and the manipulation of sacred objects, and transmitted to participants in a form that engaged the body and the emotions as well as the intellect. This kind of transmission is more durable in some ways than written transmission. A text can be lost, burned, or simply forgotten on a library shelf. But a ceremony that is performed every year by a living community, that engages the active participation of every member of that community in roles that require years of preparation to master, cannot be lost as long as the community survives. The knowledge is distributed across many minds and many bodies, not concentrated in a single document or in the memory of a single specialist. It is woven into the fabric of social life in a way that makes it resistant to the kinds of catastrophic loss that could destroy a written archive. On the other hand, the disruption of the community itself through disease, forced relocation, assimilation, or the suppression of the ceremony can destroy this kind of knowledge far more completely than the destruction of texts. A text can survive even if nobody reads it for centuries. A ceremony that is not performed for a generation or two may lose the knowledge necessary to perform it correctly. And the kind of knowledge that ceremonies transmit, knowledge about how to perform specific ritual actions in specific sequences with specific materials at specific times, is exactly the kind of knowledge that is hardest to recover once it has been lost, because it is not abstracted into propositions that can be written down, but is embedded in the practice itself. This is why the suppression of indigenous ceremonies by colonial governments was so culturally devastating. It was not just an attack on spiritual life, though it was that too. It was an attack on the knowledge systems that those ceremonies maintained. The Canadian and American governments that banned indigenous ceremonies in the late 19th century were, whether they knew it or not, attacking the libraries of the peoples they had conquered, trying to destroy their capacity to transmit knowledge across generations. The damage was enormous. Many ceremonies that were once practiced widely are now performed by only a handful of people or only by people who have reconstructed them from partial recollections and fragmentary records rather than from an unbroken chain of transmission. Some have been lost entirely. The knowledge they embodied about specific sacred places, about specific relationships between specific communities and specific species of plants or animals, about specific techniques for managing specific ecosystems, about specific histories and genealogies and cosmological understandings, is gone. But not all of it is gone. The remarkable thing, the thing that deserves to be emphasized as loudly as the loss, is how much survived. How many ceremonies are still being performed by living communities? How many languages are still being spoken by living people? How many traditions are still being transmitted from elders to children in the old ways? Through participation and observation and the gradual assumption of responsibility within a community of practice. The survival of these traditions is not accidental. It is the product of conscious, determined, sometimes heroic effort by generations of people who understood what was at stake and who chose to maintain their practices in the face of enormous pressure to abandon them. The people who conducted ceremonies in secret during the ban years. The people who sent their children to language nests when the dominant culture was insisting that those languages had no future. The people who refused to sell their sacred objects or to allow the excavation of their ancestral burial sites. The people who went to court, who lobbied legislatures, who organized and marched and voted and wrote and spoke, insisting on the right of their communities to exist as what they were and not as what the dominant culture wanted them to become. These are acts of cultural heroism. They deserve the same recognition and respect that we give to other forms of heroism. The recognition that they required courage and sacrifice and the willingness to endure significant personal cost for the sake of something larger than oneself. And they are bearing fruit. The revitalization of indigenous languages and cultures that is currently underway across North America is one of the most significant cultural developments of our time. Languages that 20 years ago had only a handful of elderly speakers now have programs training new speakers. Ceremonies that were nearly lost are being reconstructed and performed by new generations of practitioners. Traditional ecological knowledge is being documented and applied in environmental management. Indigenous governance systems are being adapted to contemporary political challenges. Indigenous art traditions are thriving and evolving, speaking to the present from a deep foundation in the past. This is the context in which the archaeological and historical study of pre-Columbian North America needs to be understood, not as the study of a dead past, but as the study of a living tradition that has roots going back 12,000 years or more, and that is still growing and adapting and finding new forms of expression in the present. The mysteries we have been exploring in this long journey, the mysteries of who the first Americans were and where they came from, of what they built and what they knew, of what collapsed and what survived, of how the enormous catastrophe of the colonial period was endured and what came after. These mysteries are not just academic puzzles. They're questions that matter to real people, to the communities whose ancestors built the earthworks and the cliff dwellings and the canal systems, who navigated the open ocean and developed the agricultural systems and maintained the ceremonies that encoded knowledge across generations. Those communities have a stake in how these questions are answered, a stake that is different from, and in some ways more urgent than the stake that academic researchers have. This is one of the reasons why the field of indigenous archaeology and the broader field of indigenous studies has been transformed in recent decades by the insistence of indigenous communities on participating in the research that is about their own heritage, on having their own knowledge systems and their own interpretations taken seriously alongside the findings of Western science, and on having control over what happens to the material remains of their ancestors. These are not just political demands. They are epistemological demands. demands about whose knowledge counts, and how different kinds of knowledge should be weighed against each other. The transformation is incomplete, and the tensions are real, but the direction of travel is clear. The study of pre-Columbian North America is becoming a more collaborative, more pluralistic, and ultimately a more rigorous enterprise as indigenous perspectives are integrated into it. The questions are being asked differently. The evidence is being interpreted with a wider range of frameworks. And some of the silences that have characterized the standard accounts are being filled in by voices that have always known what the textbooks left out. Let me tell you about one of those silences, one that is being filled in now in ways that are transforming our understanding of the pre-Columbian world. For most of the history of North American archaeology, the pre-Columbian past was treated as essentially static. Cultures were identified, classified, given names and dates, and then placed in a typological sequence that treated them as essentially self-contained entities, separated from each other by boundaries of time and space that made them easier to categorize, but less comprehensible as expressions of living human communities. The archaic gave way to the woodland. The woodland gave way to the Mississippian. Each tradition described as though it emerged from nowhere and dissolved into nothing. Its connections to what came before and what came after minimized in the interest of taxonomic clarity. But human cultures do not work that way. They are not separate entities with clear boundaries. They are processes, ongoing conversations between living communities and their environments, their neighbors, their ancestors, and their own internal dynamics. The traditions that archaeologists have named and classified were not separate things. They were moments in a continuous process of adaptation and change, connected to each other and to the present by threads that run through the entire fabric of human life in the Americas. When you start looking for those threads, you find them everywhere. The cosmological motifs that appear on Mississippian pottery show clear connections to Hopewell iconography centuries earlier. The Hopewell ceremonial complex drew on traditions that go back to the Adena and to the earlier archaic ceremonial centers of the Ohio Valley. The archaic ceremonial centers drew on traditions that go back to the earliest post-Paleo-Indian period. The thread runs all the way back. The same thread runs forward. The Pueblo of the modern Southwest are the cultural descendants of the ancestral Puebloans. The languages spoken in those pueblos carry grammatical structures and vocabulary that have roots in the deep pre-Columbian past. The ceremonies practiced in those pueblos encode knowledge that was accumulated over centuries of observation and practice. The connection is not just symbolic or genetic. It is direct. The people are the same people in the most meaningful sense. And this means that the archaeological record of the pre-Columbian Americas is not just the record of the dead. It is the record of the living. It is the deep history of communities that still exist. And understanding it, with all its complexity and all its mystery, is part of understanding who those communities are and what they carry into the future. There are 12,000 years in this story. 12,000 years of human ingenuity and human suffering and human creativity and human resilience. 12,000 years of languages that have no parallel anywhere else on Earth. 12,000 years of astronomical observation and ecological management and political philosophy and artistic achievement. 12,000 years of people asking the hard questions and finding in their different ways, in their different places, answers that sustain them and their communities across time. We do not know the whole story. We will probably never know the whole story. Too much has been lost to the sea, to the fire, to the plow, to the silence of the suppressed. But what we do know, what the archaeology and the genetics and the oral traditions and the art and the landscape and the living communities all tell us together, is extraordinary enough to fill a lifetime of wondering. The mystery is real. The achievement is real. The loss is real. And the survival is real. All of it together is the story of America's first people. Still unfolding, still asking to be understood, still relevant to everything that matters about the human future on this ancient and remarkable continent. Sleep now, if you will. The ground beneath you has a long memory. And somewhere in the dark, in the earth that holds the bones of 12,000 years of human life, the story is still being told. But there's still more to say, because the mysteries of the pre-Columbian Americas do not end at the boundaries of the familiar. They extend into territories that even the most cautious and the most rigorous researchers acknowledge have not been fully mapped. Let's enter a few of those territories. Now consider the question of population and land management in the Amazon, which we touched on briefly earlier, but which deserves a much deeper exploration because it represents one of the most significant revisions of our understanding of pre-Columbian America to have occurred in the past generation. For most of the 20th century, the dominant view among ecologists and archaeologists was that the Amazon rainforest was essentially uninhabitable for large, complex societies. The poor tropical soils, the high rainfall that leaches nutrients, the distance from the major Andean civilizations. All of these factors seem to preclude the development of large populations or complex cultural traditions in the Amazon basin. This view is now understood to be wrong, dramatically wrong. The recognition that the Amazon was extensively settled and managed by large human populations before European contact is one of the most important findings in the recent history of pre-Columbian archaeology. And the implications of that finding extend far beyond the academic literature in which it was first articulated. The evidence comes from multiple sources. From the aerial surveys that have revealed, particularly in the southern Amazon and in the floodplain zones of the major rivers, the outlines of enormous geometric earthworks, road systems, causeways, and settlement patterns covering areas of hundreds of square kilometers. From excavations that have uncovered dense middens and deep deposits of cultural material in locations previously considered uninhabited. From the soil analyses that have identified terra preta deposits across hundreds of sites, showing that the dark, deep earth that characterizes these deposits is the product of sustained human occupation, of the deliberate incorporation of charcoal, bone, pottery fragments, and organic matter into the soil over periods of centuries or millennia. And from the trees. Perhaps the most striking evidence for extensive pre-Columbian management of the Amazon comes from the trees themselves. Ecologists comparing the distribution of useful plant species across Amazonian forests have found that forests in areas with strong evidence of pre-Columbian occupation are significantly enriched in useful species. In the trees that produce food, fiber, oil, resin, or medicine, compared to areas with no evidence of occupation. The pattern is so strong that some researchers have argued that much of what we call the Amazon rainforest is in fact a kind of garden, a landscape shaped over millennia by human selection and planting, in which the distributions of thousands of species of trees and other plants reflect the preferences and needs of the people who once lived among them. This is a revolutionary idea. It means that the Amazon, far from being a pristine wilderness that humanity happened to live in the margins of, was a human-managed landscape of extraordinary complexity and productivity, maintained by populations that we are only now beginning to estimate. The estimates are striking. Some researchers now believe that at the time of European contact, the Amazon may have been home to between 8 and 50 million people. Figures that are as much as an order of magnitude larger than the estimates that prevailed just a few decades ago. What happened to all those people? Disease. The same catastrophic epidemics that swept through the rest of the Americas in the wake of European contact swept through the Amazon as well, advancing ahead of direct European presence, spread by indigenous trade networks, killing enormous proportions of the population before Europeans arrived in many areas to observe it. By the time systematic European exploration of the Amazon interior began in the 17th and 18th centuries, the populations that had built the earthworks and maintained the managed forests and created the terra preta soils were already largely gone. The landscape that European explorers described as untouched wilderness was in fact the wreckage of a civilization, the ruins of a managed garden that had lost its gardeners. The forests grew back over the abandoned settlements. The earthworks were covered by vegetation. The terra preta soils, so fertile that they continue to regenerate themselves long after the communities that created them have gone, remained, waiting to be found by archaeologists with the right tools and the right questions. And now that we are finding them, the implications are profound. They suggest that the Amazon is not just a natural heritage to be preserved from human interference. It is a cultural heritage, the product of thousands of years of human creativity and knowledge and labor. A landscape that cannot be fully understood without understanding the people who created it. The movement to protect the Amazon from deforestation and development is not just an environmental movement. It is a movement to protect one of the most extraordinary achievements of human civilization in the pre-Columbian world. This realization has been embraced by many indigenous Amazonian peoples and by the researchers who work with them. The Kayapo, the Munduraku, the Xingu peoples, and others who are fighting to protect their territories from encroachment are not just fighting for their homes. They are fighting for the legacy of their ancestors, for the landscape that those ancestors spent millennia creating and maintaining, and for the knowledge necessary to continue that maintenance. Their fight is one of the most important conservation struggles in the world. And understanding the full historical depth of what is at stake makes it more important, not less. Let us move now to another territory that has received less attention than it deserves in the standard accounts of pre-Columbian American history. That is the territory of the Caribbean. The chain of islands that stretches from the coast of Florida to the coast of Venezuela, and that serve as the site of the first sustained European contact with the Americas. The Caribbean was at the time of Columbus's arrival home to a complex of related cultures, collectively known as the Arawak or Taino, along with the island Caribs, a newly arrived people who had been expanding through the Lesser Antilles from the South American mainland. The Taino in particular had developed a sophisticated culture with complex social hierarchy, elaborate ceremonial traditions, and a productive agriculture based on manioc and sweet potato that supported large populations on the major islands of Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. The Taino were the first indigenous people of the Americas to experience sustained European contact, and they were also the first to experience the full force of the colonial catastrophe. Within 50 years of Columbus's arrival, the indigenous population of Hispaniola, estimated at between 100,000 and several million people at contact, depending on the methodology used, had been reduced to near zero. The mechanisms of destruction were multiple: epidemic disease, forced labor in the gold mines, violence, the destruction of food production systems, the psychological devastation of an encounter with a conquest so total and so rapid that it defied any previous human experience. The speed and totality of the Taino destruction shocked even some contemporary Europeans. The Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who arrived in Hispaniola in 1502 and spent the rest of his long life documenting and protesting the treatment of indigenous people by the Spanish colonists, wrote accounts of the destruction that remain among the most searing testimonies to colonial violence in the historical record. His brief account of the destruction of the Indies, written around 1542, describes massacres, torture, forced labor, and the deliberate starvation of indigenous populations with a specificity and a moral outrage that have made it a founding text of the literature of anti-colonial protest. But here too, the story is not only loss. Recent genetic research has found traces of Taino ancestry in the genomes of people living in the Caribbean today, including in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. The Taino were not completely exterminated. They intermarried with African and European populations and passed their genes and some of their cultural practices to the peoples who emerged from the colonial crucible of the Caribbean. The assertion of Taino identity by contemporary Caribbean people is contested and complex, but it reflects a genuine historical relationship between the living and the dead that genetic science is now able to document. The story of the Caribbean is a microcosm of the story of the entire hemisphere. Contact, catastrophe, partial survival, complex inheritance, the ongoing presence of the past in the lives of people who are still working out what they are and where they come from. Let us take one more journey, this time to the far north, to the Arctic, where the story of the first Americans connects to some of the most recent and most rapid human adaptations in the entire history of our species. The peoples of the Arctic, the Inuit, the Yupik, the Inupiat, and their predecessors, represent one of the most extraordinary examples of human ecological adaptation ever documented. The Arctic environment is among the most demanding on Earth. Temperatures that drop to 60 below zero, total darkness for months at a time, a landscape that is almost entirely white for half the year, offering almost no reference points for navigation. An environment in which the wrong decision, the wrong clothing, the wrong shelter, the wrong hunting strategy can mean death within hours. And yet, humans not only survived in this environment, they thrived in it. They developed a material culture that is, in terms of its ecological efficiency and its adaptation to specific environmental conditions, one of the most sophisticated in human history. The kayak, a skin-covered frame boat designed for open water hunting of marine mammals, is an engineering achievement of remarkable elegance, perfectly suited to its specific purpose. The igloo, a dome constructed from snow blocks, creates a thermally efficient shelter using only materials available in the environment, and its design principles have been recognized by modern engineers as sophisticated applications of thermal and structural dynamics. The composite bow used by some Arctic peoples to hunt caribou and muskox represents a technological achievement that required extensive knowledge of materials, animal products, and the physics of elastic energy storage. The knowledge required to survive in the Arctic was accumulated over thousands of years. Every technique for hunting seals through the sea ice, for reading weather signs, for finding the narrow leads of open water in the sea ice, where walruses and polar bears could be found, for caching and preserving food in a landscape that offered no fuel for cooking and no shelter from the wind, was the product of generations of observation and experiment and loss, of people who tried things and sometimes died when they failed, and whose surviving knowledge was passed on to the next generation through the mechanisms of oral instruction, apprenticeship, and demonstration. The Thule people, the ancestors of modern Inuit, migrated eastward from Alaska across the entire Arctic to Greenland in a rapid expansion that took less than a few centuries, beginning around 900 CE. This expansion is one of the most rapid and most geographically extensive in the history of North American prehistory, and it was associated with a specific set of technological and social innovations that gave the Thule a decisive advantage over the people they encountered on their eastward journey, including the Dorset people, a different Arctic culture that had occupied much of the eastern Arctic for thousands of years before the Thule arrival. The Dorset people are one of the great mysteries of Arctic prehistory. They developed an elaborate artistic tradition, producing small carvings of remarkable beauty and power from ivory, antler, bone, and occasionally wood. They hunted large marine mammals using technologies that appear to have been somewhat different from those of the Thule. They maintained their way of life in the eastern Arctic for 2,000 to 3,000 years. And then, within a relatively short period following the arrival of the Thule, they disappeared. What happened to the Dorset? Were they killed by the incoming Thule? Were they assimilated? Did they simply fail to compete with the more technologically advanced Thule culture and die out? The archaeological evidence suggests some degree of contact and possibly some small amount of genetic exchange between the two peoples. But the Dorset essentially disappear from the record with very little genetic legacy in modern Arctic peoples. They are one more ghost in the archaeological record of the Americas. A people who lived and created and maintained a way of life across millennia and then vanished in a historical eye blink, leaving their beautiful small carvings in the permafrost as the only memorial of their existence. The Inuit, who are the descendants of the Thule, live today in communities across the Arctic from Alaska to Greenland. They face challenges that are in some ways the most acute of any indigenous community in the world. Because the changes that human-caused climate change is bringing to the Arctic are transforming the environment faster than any previous change in the last several thousand years, potentially undermining the ecological basis of a way of life that has sustained human communities in the region for millennia. The sea ice that Inuit hunters have relied upon for thousands of years to hunt ringed seals and polar bears is diminishing. The permafrost on which coastal communities were built is thawing and collapsing. The animals that have been central to Inuit subsistence for generations are shifting their ranges or declining in numbers. The knowledge that Inuit elders have accumulated over a lifetime of observation, knowledge about ice conditions, weather patterns, animal behavior, and ecological dynamics, is becoming less reliable as a predictor of present conditions because the conditions themselves are changing faster than the knowledge can be updated. This is a crisis not just of subsistence, but of epistemology. The knowledge systems that Inuit communities have developed over thousands of years are being stress-tested by a rate of change that those systems were not designed to accommodate. And yet, those same knowledge systems contain insights about ecological observation, about reading subtle environmental signals, about maintaining sustainable relationships with the resources on which life depends, that are urgently relevant to the challenge of understanding and responding to climate change. The Inuit are not just victims of climate change. They are also experts on the Arctic environment, experts whose knowledge has depth and breadth that no scientific monitoring program of a few decades' duration can match. And they are insisting on the relevance of that expertise, on having their observations and their interpretations taken seriously in the policy discussions that will determine the future of the Arctic and through the Arctic the future of the global climate system. This insistence is one more example of the pattern we have been tracing throughout this long journey. The pattern of survival and resilience. The pattern of indigenous peoples insisting on the continuing relevance of their knowledge and their experience in the face of pressures designed to render them irrelevant. The pattern of the past refusing to stay past. Of the deep human history of this continent continuing to speak to the present in voices that deserve to be heard. We have been traveling for a long time. We have crossed the continent many times in different directions and in different periods. We have visited the deep past and the not-so-distant past and the present. We have asked questions that have no complete answers and looked at evidence that points in directions that the standard accounts do not follow. We have listened for the silences and tried to hear what they contain. What have we found? We have found a story of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary duration. A story that begins at least 15,000 years ago, possibly much earlier, with the arrival of the first human beings on a continent that had never known human presence. A story that unfolds across 12,000 years and more, through the rise and fall of dozens of major cultural traditions, through periods of extraordinary creativity and periods of catastrophic collapse, through the development of languages and art forms and agricultural systems and astronomical knowledge and philosophical traditions of remarkable depth and diversity. A story that is interrupted but not ended by one of the greatest catastrophes in human history, the demographic collapse that followed European contact, the loss of 50 to 100 million lives to disease and violence and forced labor and starvation, the loss of languages and ceremonies and knowledge systems and ways of life that have been maintained with great care across many generations. A story that continues after that catastrophe through the determined survival and the creative adaptation of the peoples who remained, through the slow and painful recovery of populations and languages and traditions that have been brought to the edge of extinction. And a story that is still being told by the living communities whose roots go down into those 12,000 years, and by the researchers and the storytellers who are working to recover and to communicate what those years contain. The mysteries have not been solved. The questions have not been answered. The ground is still full of secrets. But the conversation about those secrets is more alive, more inclusive, more rigorous, and more honest than it has ever been. And that is something worth staying awake for. Even now, even in the dark, even as the questions settle like dust into the silence, and the long history of this ancient continent surrounds you like the darkness that surrounded those Ice Age painters with their torches in the deep chambers of their caves, making visible in the light of fire what had never been seen before. The story is not over. It is never over. And that in the end may be the most important thing to understand about what really happened to America's first people across 12,000 years with no complete explanation. The story is still happening, and we are still inside it. There is a place in the American Southwest where the sky and the earth seem to negotiate with each other on terms that have nothing to do with anything built after 1500 CE. It is the canyon country of the Colorado Plateau, that vast tilted tableland of eroded sandstone and painted desert that stretches across parts of Utah, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico in landforms so alien and so beautiful that early European travelers sometimes refused to believe that they had not been transported to another planet. The canyon country was home for thousands of years to a succession of cultures that are among the most studied and in some ways the least understood in all of North American archaeology. The basket maker people, the earliest phase of the ancestral Puebloan tradition, began leaving traces in this landscape around 2,000 years ago, though human occupation of the region goes back much further. They lived in pit houses, semi-subterranean dwellings that took advantage of the Earth's insulating properties to moderate the extreme temperatures of the high desert. They wove baskets of extraordinary fineness, hence the name archaeologists gave to the culture. And they began growing corn in the canyon bottoms, a transformation that would eventually change everything about how people lived in this landscape. Over the centuries, the basket maker tradition evolved into the Puebloan tradition, as above-ground masonry construction replaced pit house architecture, as pottery replaced basketry as the primary container technology, and as the social and ceremonial organization of the communities became more elaborate. The great cliff dwellings that still stand in the canyons of the Colorado Plateau, Cliff Palace and Balcony House at Mesa Verde, Patatacan, and Keat Seal in Navajo National Monument, White House Ruin in Canyon de Chelly, represent the culmination of this tradition. They are structures of astonishing technical accomplishment and aesthetic sophistication, built into natural alcoves in the cliff faces at locations that were clearly chosen as much for their defensive value as for their shelter. The cliff dwellings were occupied for relatively brief periods, most of them between about 1200 and 1300 CE, and then they were abandoned. The people moved away, down from the cliffs and out of the canyon country, reorganizing themselves in the large Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley and the southern Arizona Plateau. The reasons for this movement are debated. Drought is again a factor, as it was for Chaco, but the movement out of the cliff dwellings also seems to have been a social reorganization, a deliberate choice to reconfigure the community in new and different ways. The cliff dwellings have been uninhabited for 700 years. They are among the best preserved archaeological sites in the world because the dry, protected environment of the natural alcoves has kept them almost unchanged since they were abandoned. Walking through Cliff Palace at Monte Verde, you can still see the plaster on the walls, the soot marks on the ceilings from cooking fires, the hand and toe holds cut into the cliff face by the people who climbed and descended these walls daily. The sense of presence is overwhelming. The sense that the people who lived here were just here, that they stepped out for a moment and might return. But they will not return. They left, and they left for reasons we are still working out. And the silence of the cliff dwellings is one of the most eloquent silences in the American landscape. A silence that speaks of choices made and worlds ended and the inevitability of change in all human things. The Hopi people of northeastern Arizona are among the recognized descendants of the ancestral Puebloans. Their mesas, where they have lived continuously for almost 1,000 years in some cases, are among the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in North America. The Hopi maintain an elaborate ceremonial calendar, with ceremonies performed at specific times in response to specific seasonal and astronomical markers. That represents one of the most complete and most ancient ceremonial traditions still practiced in North America. Their pottery, their weaving, their Kachina carving traditions, and their architecture all connect them directly to the ancestral Puebloan past. They are the living link between that past and the present. The Hopi have been remarkably resistant to the pressures of Americanization that transformed so many other native cultures in the 19th and 20th centuries. This resistance has not been without cost. Hopi children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, just like children from other tribes. Hopi ceremonies were suppressed or disrupted. Hopi sacred objects were stolen or sold. But the Hopi community maintained the core of its ceremonial tradition, the essential knowledge and the essential practices through those difficult decades. And that tradition continues to animate Hopi life today. The Hopi prophecies, a body of oral tradition that has attracted considerable attention from outside observers, speak of the current period in world history as a time of critical choice. A time when humanity must decide whether to continue on a path of destruction or to return to the values of balance, respect, and reciprocity that the Hopi understanding of the cosmos requires. These prophecies are not predictions in the conventional sense. They are descriptions of the patterns that the Hopi understand as governing the cycles of world history, and they are invitations to reflection and to choice. Whether you find this compelling or not, the Hopi understanding of their own position in world history is one more example of the way in which the deep past of the pre-Columbian Americas continues to speak to the present through the mouths of living people who are the custodians of traditions going back thousands of years. It is one more reason why the story of America's first people is not a matter only for archaeologists and anthropologists. It is a matter for all of us who live on this continent, and for all of us who care about the human future. The questions that this story raises are not comfortable ones. They ask us to look at the history of this continent with an honesty that the standard accounts often lack. To acknowledge the scale of what was destroyed here and who destroyed it. To recognize the depth and sophistication of what existed before the destruction. to take seriously the knowledge and the wisdom embedded in the traditions that survived, and to consider what obligations that history places on those of us who are living with its consequences. These are not questions with easy answers. They are questions that require the kind of sustained attention and genuine humility that the mysteries of the pre-Columbian Americas themselves seem to model. Those mysteries do not resolve into simple stories. They deepen and complicate and surprise. They keep giving back something new to those who keep asking. And in that refusal to resolve, in that insistence on complexity and depth and ongoing discovery, they're perhaps the most honest representation of the human story that we have. The first Americans were here for 12,000 years before Columbus arrived. In those 12,000 years, they built something extraordinary. Not just the earthworks and the cliff dwellings and the canal systems. Something harder to see, but more important. A way of being in the world that recognized the obligations between the living and the dead, between the human and the non-human, between the present and the future. A way of knowing that was embedded in practice and ceremony and relationship, rather than in abstraction and text. A way of living that treated the land not as a resource to be exploited, but as a community to be honored and cared for. That way of being, that way of knowing, that way of living was not perfect. It produced its own forms of violence and hierarchy and environmental damage. But it was a genuine and sophisticated response to the fundamental challenge of human existence on this earth. The challenge of living sustainably and meaningfully in a specific place over a long period of time. And in many respects, it was more adequate to that challenge than the civilization that replaced it. We live now with the consequences of that replacement, with the ecological crises that have followed the 300-year experiment in treating the Americas as a resource to be extracted rather than a community to be sustained. With the social crises that have followed the destruction of the knowledge systems and the social structures that once maintained that community. With the loss that is the background noise of life on this continent. The persistent sense that something important is missing, something that we have not been able to name or to replace. Maybe what is missing is precisely what the first Americans spent 12,000 years developing. The knowledge of how to live here, in this place, on these terms, in relationship with these specific beings, and these specific cycles, and these specific obligations. Maybe recovering some of that knowledge, in whatever forms are available to us, is one of the most important tasks facing the people who live in this place now. The mystery of America's first people is not just a historical puzzle. It is an invitation to pay attention to the ground beneath our feet, to the stories it holds, to the peoples who are still telling those stories, and to the questions that those stories raise for all of us about how we are living and how we want to live and what we owe to the place and the time we inhabit. That invitation is always open. The ground is always ancient. The questions are always there. And somewhere in the darkness of this long night, in the deep quiet between one breath and the next, the first Americans are still present, still asking us to look, still asking us to listen, still asking us to remember. Let us linger a little longer in the space between the known and the unknown, because there is one more thread worth following before the night fully closes in. It is the thread that connects the material world of pre-Columbian North America to the world of dreams. Every culture in the world has a relationship to dreams. Some treat them as random noise, the brain processing the events of the day. Others treat them as communications from the ancestors, the spirits, the unconscious depths of the self, or forces beyond the self. The pre-Columbian peoples of North America in general took dreams extraordinarily seriously. Dreams were revelatory. They were diagnostic. They were sources of power and of knowledge and of obligation. A dream could change the course of a life, direct a migration, identify an illness, reveal the location of a lost animal or a distant enemy, or communicate the wishes of the dead. The Haudenosaunee developed one of the most elaborate dream theories in the world. At the heart of their ceremonial life was a practice of dream guessing, in which a dreamer would communicate the essential content of a dream, often in disguised or metaphorical form, and members of the community would attempt to guess its meaning and to satisfy the desire expressed in the dream, because the Haudenosaunee believed that unsatisfied desires of the soul, revealed through dreams, could cause physical and social illness. The dream was not an epiphenomenon. It was a direct communication from the deepest level of the self, and attending to it was not optional but obligatory. This understanding of the relationship between the inner life and the social world, between the private experience of dreaming and the public obligations of community, reflects a sophistication about human psychology that Western intellectual traditions did not begin to approach until the late 19th century. The Haudenosaunee were not waiting for Freud. They had already developed, through observation and practice and accumulated wisdom over hundreds of years, an understanding of the significance of unconscious mental life that anticipates its insights while embedding them in a social and ceremonial context that gives them a different and perhaps deeper resonance. The dream traditions of the Plains peoples were equally elaborate, centered on the vision quest. The practice of going alone into the wilderness for a period of fasting and exposure and prayer, seeking a vision that would reveal the individual's relationship to the spirit world and the powers that would guide their life. The vision quest was not a romantic spiritual adventure. It was a serious and sometimes dangerous undertaking, an act of submission and openness to forces larger than the individual self. And the visions it produced were not simply personal, but were interpreted in relation to the traditions of the community and the accumulated wisdom of the culture about the meanings of specific symbols and encounters. The keeper of dreams and visions was the shaman. In many cultures, though that word covers an enormous range of different roles and practices across the pre-Columbian world, the shaman was the specialist in the boundary between the human and the other than human. The practitioner who could cross that boundary through trance, through sacrifice, through ceremony, through the ingestion of plant medicines, and return with knowledge that could heal the sick, identify the causes of misfortune, locate game, influence the weather, or mediate between the living and the dead. The role of the shaman was the oldest specialist role in human society, older than the potter, older than the farmer, older than the warrior. It was the original intellectual, the first person designated by a community to devote their life to the investigation of the invisible dimensions of reality and to the translation of that investigation into socially useful knowledge. And in the pre-Columbian Americas, that role took forms of extraordinary diversity and sophistication. From the elaborate shamanistic traditions of the Arctic, to the medicine society practices of the Great Lakes, to the Kachina priests of the Southwest, to the healing chant practitioners of the Navajo tradition. The knowledge that these practitioners carried, knowledge about the relationship between the inner life and the outer world, about the mechanisms of healing and the dynamics of illness, about the obligations between the living and the dead and the unborn, about the protocols that govern relationships between humans and the other beings with whom we share the world. This knowledge was as sophisticated in its own domain as the engineering knowledge that built the Hohokam canals or the astronomical. Knowledge that aligned the Newark earthworks to the lunar cycle. It was produced by the same mechanisms: close observation, accumulated experience, systematic training, and the willingness to revise understanding in the light of new evidence. and much of it is still present in the practices of the medicine societies that still function in the pueblos of the Southwest, in the healing ceremonies of the Navajo and the Apache and the Lakota and dozens of other peoples, in the vision quest traditions that are still practiced by many Plains peoples, in the sweat lodge ceremonies that serve simultaneously as purification, as prayer, and as a form of physiological therapy whose effectiveness has begun to be documented by biomedical researchers, and in the plant knowledge that is still held by the elders of many communities. Knowledge of medicinal plants and their preparations that represents an empirical pharmacology accumulated over thousands of years of careful clinical observation. This knowledge is the most intimate and the most perishable of all the legacies of the pre-Columbian Americas. It requires living practitioners to transmit it. It cannot be simply written down and preserved in an archive because the most important dimensions of it are embedded in practice, in the actual performance of the ceremony, in the embodied knowledge of how to prepare and administer specific plant medicines, in the relational context of the healing encounter, in the understanding of the specific community and its history that gives meaning to a specific act of healing. Every elder who passes away without having fully transmitted their knowledge is a library burning. Every community that loses its last fluent speaker of an indigenous language loses access to a way of encoding and transmitting knowledge that cannot be fully recovered through any other medium. Every ceremony that is last performed by a generation that was not able to fully train their successors becomes a partial record, rich but incomplete, of what was once a living and fully functional knowledge system. The urgency of the present moment for indigenous communities across North America is in part the urgency of this transmission, of getting the knowledge from those who hold it to those who will need it, of doing so in time against the clock of aging elders and disrupted communities and the competing attractions of the modern world, of finding ways to transmit knowledge that was designed for transmission through performance and apprenticeship in a world that has been partially transformed by literacy and digital media and the mobility that takes young people away from their home communities precisely when they should be receiving the knowledge those communities hold. Some communities are succeeding at this transmission. Language nests where children are immersed in indigenous languages from infancy are producing new fluent speakers. Master apprentice programs are pairing elders who hold specialized knowledge with younger people who are committed to receiving and continuing it. Cultural camps and language camps and ceremonial gatherings are maintaining the social context in which transmission is most effective. Recordings of elders made with proper protocols and stored with proper care are preserving at least the verbal dimension of knowledge that was meant to be transmitted in person. These efforts are not enough. They cannot be enough given the scale of what has been lost and what is still being lost. But they are real and they are producing results, and they are being supported by a growing alliance between indigenous communities and researchers and governments and foundations that understand the value of what is being preserved. The story of America's first people across 12,000 years ends here in the present, in the ongoing effort to maintain and transmit and honor and continue what those 12,000 years produced. It ends in the classrooms where children are learning to speak their grandparents' languages, in the sweat lodges where ceremonies are being performed that connect the living to generations of practitioners going back beyond any historical record, in the archaeology laboratories where researchers are working with indigenous communities to understand the material record of the pre-Columbian past in ways that are respectful of the living descendants of the people who created it, in the forests and the rivers and the mountains that are being managed in some places according to the principles developed by the people who lived in those landscapes for thousands of years. It ends and begins in the questions that this long story has raised. Questions about time and knowledge and survival and obligation. Questions about what we owe to the past and what we owe to the future. Questions about how to live in a specific place in a way that honors its history and maintains its capacity to support life. Questions that the pre-Columbian peoples of North America spent 12,000 years trying to answer and that we are still trying to answer now. The mystery is not solved. It is deepened. And in the deepening, in the ongoing encounter with the complexity and the beauty and the tragedy and the resilience of what really happened to America's first people, there is something that might be the beginning of wisdom. Not certainty, not resolution, but the willingness to keep asking, to keep looking, to keep listening, to stay with the mystery long enough for it to teach us something real. The night is deep, the questions are old, and the ancient ground is patient. It has been waiting 12,000 years for us to pay attention. It can wait a little longer. And in that patience, in the patience of the earth and the patience of the peoples who have tended it across all those thousands of years of darkness and light and cold and heat and flood and drought, there's a kind of teaching that no lecture can fully convey and no book can completely contain. It is the teaching that the living world offers to those who are willing to sit quietly in it long enough for it to speak. That time is longer than we think. That knowledge is deeper than we know. And that the story of who we are and where we come from is still unfolding in ways that will surprise and humble us if we have the courage to keep paying attention. Good night. The first Americans are still here. Also, like and subscribe to my channel. Ancient Tales sleep. Good night, sweet dreams.